from the University of Virginia Center for Politics.
Perfect. Hey, well, good afternoon. I'm Colin Allen. I'm the Executive Director of the American Property Owners Alliance. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit advocacy organization based here in Washington, D.C. It's an honor to be here. I'd like to thank the UVA Center for Politics for organizing the event and bringing together these leaders to analyze the election results and talk about shaping a path forward that strengthens our democracy. A special thanks here really to Professor Larry Sabato. He's somebody I'd consider a mentor, a friend, and whose work has really profoundly shaped our understanding of American politics. Professor Sabato, again, really your leadership makes this dialogue possible, and we're all the better for it. As a proud sponsor of this event, the American Property Owners Alliance is honored to support this vital conversation. Our mission is to advocate for policies that protect property owners, promote housing affordability, and expand opportunities for home ownership. These are essential elements of the American dream and pillars of community stability. And really, we're here because a politically active and engaged core of property owners is vital to maintain that American dream and to protect property rights across the nation. So really leading in, right, for the first time in modern history, housing affordability has emerged as a defining issue in a national election. A survey from the Alliance found that over 60% of voters would consider candidates' stance on housing issues and in the presidential election and how they would vote. This reflects our growing sense of urgency in the housing crisis that we're looking at, and it's across the American political spectrum. We're pleased to see that President Trump has shown some leadership on key issues, including his recent proposal to raise the capital and state and local taxes. The SALT cap enacted in 2017 has disproportionately affected or burdened middle-class homeowners in high-tax states, making it harder to manage property taxes and related costs. Raising this cap would provide much-needed relief to millions of Americans. The focus on tax fairness is important, but it's also only part of the solution. We need to focus on market-based solutions to address the growing supply crisis in the housing market. And where we've seen economists and housing experts agree, right? Increasing the housing supply is going to be one of the most effective ways to stabilize prices and to improve affordability across the nation. President Trump has an opportunity to push for policies that can boost some housing production, and that can be done through tax credits for developers, streamlining zoning regulations, and incentivizing affordable housing development. These are common sense actions that can help restore balance to the housing market and give families more opportunities to get affordable homes and apartments moving forward. I'm really excited to hear what our panelists have to say today, especially as we're looking into the first 100 days agenda. We've seen the incoming administration really kick off and start moving quickly. So I think things that we can move forward with really quickly would be restoring critical homeowner tax incentives, expanding housing supply through bipartisan action, and really like tackling this shortage requires some of these market-driven solutions, right? Proposals like the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act could encourage investment in revitalization in distressed communities, and increases in the low-income housing tax credit could boost production there as well. These measures have bipartisan support and would create more options for middle-income families, first-time buyers, renters, and they would strengthen the communities and foster economic development. So voters have made clear that homeownership and housing affordability are key issues, and I'm really encouraged by the indications the incoming Trump administration has put out there that they recognize the importance of these issues. Again, right, we're looking for market-based solutions to fix the housing supply shortage, provide tax relief for owners, and moves forward on common sense efforts to revitalize our housing markets. Again, thanks for your attention here. If you're interested, I'd invite you to learn more about the American Property Owners Alliance by visiting propertyownersalliance.org. Follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. Would really appreciate your attention there. But we'll get with the program here, and I will introduce again my friend, mentor, Professor Larry Sabato.
Thank you so much, Colin. We appreciate tremendously you're bringing the American Property Owners Alliance into an alliance with us. Colin was my assistant a quarter century ago, which to me is like yesterday at my age. But we were remembering this, that, and the other, and most of them good memories, but we also remembered the day that we ended up right where the DC sniper was. And it was, I don't think we ever knew it until later, but we were driving around trying to avoid this guy. And we had good luck, and that's because you were a good driver. And you were weaving in and out of traffic, and it was great. And we survived. That's all you can ask. Thank you so much, Colin. We look forward to working together with you. We're expecting a couple of buses full of students, including from Charlottesville. It's a terrible accident on 29 headed to D.C., and they've been held up. Either that or they had a long lunch, which is, knowing the students, it's free. So, possible that that's what it is. But they will be here shortly and filling some of those seats. And we are delighted about that. Let me also thank the students that are here from the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, joining our UVA students. And a special thanks to the George Washington University and their students for hosting us today. We appreciate the rest of you who came out this afternoon. I just thought, UVA, Thomas Jefferson, George Mason, who's the other one? George Washington. That's the first time in 200 years these founders have been together. They're here in spirit. I sense them, but you have to be really old to be able to do that. Okay, for 26 years, this American Democracy Conference has been held annually, and we do it by assembling some of the top political insiders, pollsters, journalists, party representatives, a wide range of political strategists to discuss the most recent election, and that was a big one. And we also look forward to the next big events in politics. So we're happy to have survived for 26 years and 27th next year, fingers crossed. The core mission of the Center for Politics is to encourage active civic engagement and participation in politics and government, regardless of which candidate you vote for, which party you support. It's important for our country's future that young and old alike take an active interest in politics, and not just in a presidential election year, but all year, every year. Elections are decided by the people who show up, but our responsibilities as citizens don't end on election day. You must watch all of these people on TV every time they appear. That is part of your responsibility as a citizen. That's what I was taught growing up. Not really, but I should have been. Whether you're a Democrat, Republican, Independent, stay engaged and active in politics. And now is not a time to look away. Now it's a time to get even more involved. The conference today will feature two excellent panels, each with a stellar group of people who keep a very watchful eye on all things political. Between the two panels, CNN contributor and Center for Politics scholar Paul Begala, you remember him from the Clinton campaigns in the prior century. Tell him I said that, since he's not here right now. And Paul's colleague and CNN contributor Scott Jennings, and they will engage in a one-on-one conversation. And they don't shout and yell. I don't think I've ever seen them yell on TV, and they both have a sense of humor. Paul in particular has a great sense of humor. So I know you'll enjoy that. Now, let's get to the first panel. It'll be moderated by Rick Klein, who is the vice president and Washington, D.C. bureau chief for ABC News. Now, first, I want you to know he's graciously filling in for Jonathan Karl, whose excuse this time was that he had to go to Mar-a-Lago on short notice. And I kind of believe it, because for whatever reason, Donald Trump will actually talk to him and tell him interesting things for his next book. Does ABC get a cut of the profits from these books?
No comment.
No comment. Okay. All right. But something that I particularly want you to know here is that Rick, today, it's his 48th birthday. And so
happy birthday, buddy.
happy birthday. And you're saved from hearing a rendition of the happy birthday song
Appreciate
because I
that.
can't sing a note. You're absolutely safe. Rick oversees ABC Bureau operations and manages all news teams based in DC for breaking news, daily coverage, and special events. He supervises all the coverage, including the network's Sunday morning public affairs program this week with George Stephanopoulos. You've gotten really good at that polling board and, running through the number.
A lot of fun.
No, it looks like it's what you seem to enjoy it. And that is communicated to the viewers, even if they're unhappy with the numbers. They can see that you're enjoying it. Let's see. We've already said that.
Yep.
He's helped plan and produce, this is interesting, more than 20 debates and candidate town halls for ABC News. I'm sure you enjoyed working with all the staffs and candidates.
Best.
They're wonderful. In addition to the 2012 vice presidential debate and the 2016 town hall style presidential debate, also town hall forums featuring Donald Trump and Joe Biden in the fall of 2020 on ABC. Oh, the last election. I went back 4 years. I forgot we were already in 2024. I wish I could permanently believe we were still in 2020. Rick, we appreciate your taking time to be with us on any day, but particularly on your 48th birthday. And that's very young, by the way.
I agree.
And
I agree.
I'm very resentful. Please come on up.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Larry.
Oh,
And
you're just going to
I can stay right here. Thank you, Larry. Thank you all for being here today and for the opportunity to have this important discussion today. Just to introduce our panelists right here on my left is Glenn Bolger, who's the partner and co-founder at Public Opinion Strategies, one of the leading Republican pollsters in the country, worked on dozens and dozens of major races over the last several election cycles. Then next up is Maria Cardona, principal at the Dewey Square Group, who leads the multicultural and public affairs practice, also one of the most influential Latino voices in the country. You'll see her all over the place, rightfully so. Next, we have David Ramadan, who is a scholar here at the Center for Politics, also served 2 terms in the Virginia House of Delegates last decade, and has been a key advisor to political candidates up and down the ballot, from president down to the Senate and governor and U.S. House. Next up is Mark Short. Mark was the chief of staff to Vice President Mike Pence, was also the assistant to the president and legislative director for President Trump. In that capacity, he shepherded through some of the leading accomplishments of the Trump years, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And if you saw him on TV, he was often right behind Neil Gorsuch, working those halls of Congress to get that successful confirmation to the court. And then last but not least, Michael Toner, who's a partner at the Wiley Ryan law firm, former chairman of the Federal Election Commission, who knows everything you need to know about money and politics and election law compliance and how it all works. So thank you to everyone here. I just wanted to start with the news just a few minutes ago. We're 16 days into this transition. We thought we had basically a full Trump cabinet named, but we just had our first person drop out in the person of the Attorney General designate Matt Gaetz, who just announced about an hour ago that he is not going to pursue that after all. And I want to start with Mark Short, because 8 years ago this time, Mark was in and around Trump Tower, helping the Trump-Pence administration begin to fill out, begin to take shape. And it does strike me that this is a lot different than that time in look as well as feel. A lot of these announcements are happening kind of quickly on Truth Social, and now to have this very early withdrawal. What's your sense, Mark, of what's different this time around about the incoming Trump administration, and how much of this is strategy and design versus just Trump whims?
Well, I think there's some things that are different, but I think there's some things that are constant, to be honest, Rick. I think the reality is it's going to be whimsical in some ways. I do think that there is somewhat of a casting call mentality to forming his cabinet. But, you know, it was not as if it was necessarily orderly 8 years ago. As you recall, right after the election, Chris Christie was removed as head of the transition. And Chris and his team, I think, had worked a lot of hours preparing a lot of different bios and suggestions for how to form an administration. And it was sort of like starting from scratch after the election day. But as you and I were discussing on the way up, I do think that we did have typically background checks before names were presented to the American people. And even though it was, I think, somewhat of a, I think the media took great joy in watching sort of the theater of the president coming down Trump Tower and doing press conferences to announce him, that nonetheless was somewhat orchestrated, and after deliberation was made, that decision was made. It seems like today a lot of these decisions came out very fast via, tweets or some sort of Truth Social post, that I think takes away an opportunity to talk to the American people about why you're naming somebody and what that agenda is, when it's simply put out on Truth Social. I think you miss a little bit of an opportunity to help shape the message behind that. But I also think that there's a lot of desire from a lot of Republican voters who I think reelected Donald Trump because they're still unsatisfied with the status quo in Washington, want to tear things down. And I think that incentive can sometimes be misunderstood here in this town and in media circles. And I think it's actually a very real and a very strong sentiment from a lot of Americans who are unhappy with the status quo and unhappy with Washington. I do think that there are ways, though, that you can have people nominated to reform the Department of Justice who are not trafficking for sex and drugs teenage girls. I think there are other nominees who could actually perform the same function of actual reforming the department, who perhaps have had a background check and don't have that same baggage to be the top law enforcement officer of the land.
Glenn Bolger, this was obviously a resounding victory for Republicans up and down the ticket. Striking, as Larry was mentioning, I was on the boards on election night to see county after county, state after state make this shift toward Republicans, at certainly the top of the ticket and often well below. What's your sense of what this period means for the mandate? Does it matter much that Donald Trump is running this kind of chaotic transition? Is that what people expect? Is it just sort of noise? And what does it mean for Republicans as they settle into governance, united governance, and control of Washington?
Well, when you have one-party control, you tend not to have it that long, because the party that has the one-party control tends to overreach in wanting to reach their goals, and the voters then 2 years later kind of punish the party that controls everything. And when you look at it, we're at a historic time where we've had 6 elections in a row, both midterm and presidential, where at least one of the 3, well, I shouldn't say branches, but the House, Senate, and or White House has changed control. Now, I remember I went back into the archives and looked at Professor Sabato's crystal ball from these other elections that have been 5 in a row, and he probably remembers, because he covered it, the 5 in a row. The first set was in 1840 to 1848, and then the second was from 1888 to 1896. So we've reached a new unprecedented streak of change. So what you're faced with, as the Republican Party is right now, is do you go for as much as you can in the first 2 years thinking, well, this might be the only bite at the apple that we get? Or do you say, okay, let's get what we can, but not overreach? And time will tell what will happen.
Maria, what are your takeaways from the election a couple weeks ago and what we've seen so far about this new transition? Obviously, there are a lot of surprises for a lot of people.
Yes.
But how are you processing it, and how are Democrats kind of taking this moment?
Democrats are upset, obviously. It was not something that we expected, in all honesty. Democrats, I think, across the board, and frankly, a lot of Republicans who I spoke to prior to the election, not all, but many, expected for Kamala Harris to win, and that just did not happen. And I think it has a lot to do with either misreading of the polls, or the polls didn't go deep enough, didn't register the sentiment. I know that polling has gotten a lot tougher and more challenging, but I think this is going to be a time where obviously Democrats are going to do a deep dive into what happened. We've already started to hear a lot of recriminations. I don't think that's helpful, but it is clearly something that the party has to be reflective in terms of what we did, what we missed, what we didn't do, what we should have done, so that we can figure out what to do next in the next 2 years, because I do think there's a lot of opportunity. But I do think there's a couple of things that we need to keep in mind. Republicans keep talking about a mandate. And let's remember that this will probably be one of the smallest popular votes that Republicans have won in a long time. Donald Trump has not gotten to 50%. He's right below 50%. So the majority of Americans did not vote for him. I focus a lot on the Latino vote. There was some shifts in Latino vote to Republicans, and that is something that Democrats are going to have to contend with. But what's interesting to me is that there was a big polling a consortium of Latino organizations that did a big exit poll of 3,000 Latino voters that really went into a lot of questions as to what Latinos did, who they voted for, why they voted for that person. We saw that still the majority of Latinos voted for Kamala Harris. But the ones that voted for Trump voted for him on economic policies. And a lot of the disenchanted Democrats who voted for Trump voted for him on economic policies, right? They were not happy with what they had seen from the Biden administration. They blamed the Biden administration, as, you know, Americans do when an administration is in power and they don't feel the change that they need to feel, especially on an economic front. They punished Kamala Harris and the Democrats. So moving forward, I think Republicans have to be really careful, to what you were saying earlier, not to overreach, because while voters, Democrats, Latinos, everyone who voted for Donald Trump voted for him on an economic front, I know that a lot of Republicans, I think, are expecting for him to do change on a lot of other things. But that is where I think the Republican Party either has an opportunity to govern for all of Americans and not overreach and just really focus on the economic piece, or they can overreach and then, you know, figure out that in 2 years or in 4 years, Americans are going to punish them for that overreach. Because I don't think that Americans, a majority of Americans voted, for example, for mass deportation, for family separation, for getting rid of the Department of Education, for having the Justice Department be the Department of Retribution, right? All of those things that Trump has talked about, and that he can probably say, well, I won, so all Americans want me to do this, and that's just not the case.
David, obviously, it's a lot of lessons to be drawn. It'll take a long time to digest. But what did you learn from a couple weeks ago, and how do you see it playing out in local races, in state level races? Are there tangible takeaways that you've begun to process in having conversations the last couple of weeks about a new reality, electoral reality, political policy reality?
First, let me just follow up on Maria for a second. They are going to overreach. I mean, that's a reality. Yeah. Matt Gaetz is an overreach, right? I mean, there's no other way of putting it, right? So we're going to see that. And we can hope a lot of things, but reality is one thing. Perception is another. And that's what we realized as well in this election. The perception of a bad economy was the number one factor, right? Economy actually wasn't bad. Economy was pretty good. If you look at stock options, we look at unemployment, we look at all this. But inflation was high. And because inflation is high, now the perception that the economy was bad. And that affected everybody, not just Latino vote. I work on issues on minority votes overall. I'm a Lebanese immigrant and with the Latino part of the family. And we saw it across minorities. That's right. That shifted to Trump purely on economic issues. They prioritized the table issues today, the kitchen table issues, the pocketbook of the family today on the cost of immigration rights. Just like women, more women voted. They prioritized the family issues on their women's rights, right? It's just reality. Virginia, where I come from, will be the test of what happens. As you know, in Virginia, we have an election. We're a state for lovers of elections. And we have an election every year in the Commonwealth of Virginia. A former colleague of mine sitting, I just saw former Delegate Keem there, and I went through this for years, where we had to deal with an election every year. We're one of 2 states that'll have a gubernatorial election next year, in addition to a General Assembly election. Jersey and Virginia. Jersey is a foregone conclusion how it goes, so Virginia will become the bellwether of are Americans okay with overreach by Republicans? Are Americans not okay with that? We have currently a Democratic General Assembly with a Republican governor. We have, it's pretty much set who are the nominees for governor already for next year. It's going to be former Congresswoman Spanberger against Lieutenant Governor Winsome Sears. We're going to see, Winsome, we actually have a former member of the Virginia Senate who's running for Senate again, who called herself, I am Trump, her quotes, I am Trump on heels. So I can't call Winsome Trump on heels because she's not, but Winsome is very conservative and extreme candidate on some issues. So we'll see if America will realize that what happened on national level was the right thing, or are they going to reflect against it? With the exception of one time when Terry McAuliffe was elected to governor the first time, second time he ran when he got elected to governor. That was the only time where Virginia voted a governor of the same party of the president. So the expectation is people will say, nope, thank you, we're going to pass on Republicans and vote for a Democrat, but time will tell.
Michael Toner, your thoughts about this election and whether there's any kind of permanent takeaways or bigger realignments that came into view for you?
Well, Rick, I love money in politics, and so this election was nirvana for me. And I'll just share a couple statistics.
You get a cut?
I get excited about the data, so I'll try to keep it under control. But just look at some of this top-line data. The Harris-Walz campaign raised $1.5 billion in 105 days. That works out, I'm not a math major, I was an English major at UVA, but that works out to $100 million a week, every week. For 105 days. To put this in perspective, the Biden campaign in 2020 was the first campaign to ever raise more than $1 billion during the entire campaign. Mm-hmm. And so the Harris campaign was able to raise $500 million more of that in 100 plus days. Just a remarkable fundraising figure. And when you look at the Biden campaign and the Harris campaign collectively during this cycle, $2.2 billion in total raised. And that's about a 2-to-1 fundraising edge over the Trump campaign. And yes, super PACs are important, outside groups are very important, but people who work in politics, there's no substitute for hard money raised by a presidential campaign that's controlled by the campaign team, and advertising dollars go so much farther because of lowest unit charge rules, the FCC lowest unit charge rules. Oftentimes the spread in terms of campaign advertising rates versus outside groups, 15-to-1 in some of these states to get the same bang for the buck. So that was a remarkable top line figure. We also learned a lot this year how much it costs to pay and retain famous celebrities. Certainly learned a lot about that. So about $1 million spent to Oprah Winfrey's production company for the concert or for the event that was put on featuring her, and about $2 million each to hire Lady Gaga, Beyonce, and Katy Perry, and those were wonderful concerts. But I think there's going to be a lot of review of that spend. And a remarkable statistic, the latest advertising statistics, the Trump campaign, while all these concerts were going on, actually outspent the Harris campaign on network television in October, despite being outraised 2-to-1. So some really fascinating data points. And then collectively about $16 billion spent on federal elections across the country. But there's one statistic when I teach campaign finance classes, I always like to look up the latest statistics on how much Americans spend on Halloween. Okay. Again, I love these figures. I'll be brief. About $4 billion this year on Halloween candy. okay? About another $7 billion on Halloween costumes and decorations. So all in, between 11 and 12 billion. And as I like to say, isn't the leader of the next free world worth at least that much? And I think it's always important to put some of these record-breaking numbers in perspective. And then I'll close with Trump was outspent in his last 3 presidential elections. Hillary Clinton outspent him significantly in 2016. He was outspent by Biden in 2020. And of course, again, this time, it does show you the limits of money.
Yeah.
All campaigns want more money. Every campaign I've worked for, you always want more money, but it doesn't necessarily buy you what you're ultimately seeking. And this campaign really drove that point home.
I would say Americans probably enjoy Halloween a little more than they do an election.
Hey, I'm a big Halloween person. I like Halloween.
But I want to follow up one quick point because I want to turn the conversation into polling a little bit. And this was a race that was close start to finish. It never seemed to move other than when Biden obviously his numbers were quite poor. He drops out. Harris gets in. There's a little bit of maybe a sugar high in the polling, but otherwise we just saw those lines kind of stay steady. Did any of this money matter in the end? Were they just spending each other into oblivion, and at the end of the day it was just going to land where it did, or do you see evidence that some of this spend? Well, this actually made a difference.
Well, I think there's a couple of ways to peel that onion. First of all, there's I think broad-based consensus at the presidential level where you can get so much earned media that spending, you have to look at that phenomenon as well alongside it. And obviously, Trump is very good at garnering earned media, no question about that. I think secondly, what's important in presidential races, but also, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about the U.S. Senate and U.S. House, you don't have to outspend your opponent, you have to spend enough to get known. And particularly when a challenger is facing an incumbent, a lot of times they lose because they just don't raise enough money to get known. But if you cross that hurdle, you don't have to outspend the incumbent. And in some of these Senate races, the challenger was outspent by the incumbent and won anyway. But the Democrats have a major structural advantage on what we call hard dollar fundraising, presidential campaigns, U.S. Senate campaigns, U.S. House campaigns. I don't think that's going away. Republicans have had some innovations that maybe we can talk about to try to narrow that delta a little bit. But when you're spending $2-3 million on extravagant concerts and falling behind on advertising in October, I do think those are data points that have to be looked at, going forward.
I want to talk polling. It's come up a couple times already, and it's come up a lot in the conversations, not just over the last couple of weeks, but the last decade or so. In 2016, quite clearly, the state level polling did not reflect the probability that Donald Trump would win. National polling seemed to get it a little bit better. This time around, it seemed to my read of it, and I'll direct this first to you, Glenn, that the state level polling was a little bit better. It showed how close it was in the battleground states. The national polling, our polling, most polling never had Donald Trump north of 47 or 48. You're never really approaching 50, which you'd think even statistically you'd occasionally get that if it was as close as it was. So Glenn, what's your kind of meta take on the polls? Were you doing a better job in your polling? Did you find the secret sauce that everyone else was missing, or is there something just different about this era technologically or culturally that is making it impossible for pollsters or more difficult for pollsters to get an accurate lead, or is this not really a surprise in the end based on the polling?
If you look at the data, it's really not a surprise. There were many firms, many polls that were released publicly that had it either tied or a 2-point race, and that's within the margin of error. Right now, Donald Trump's lead is down in the popular vote is down to 1.6%. Our last survey, we're the Republican half. We partner with the Democratic firm for polling for both NBC and CNBC. The CNBC poll is different. They tend to focus more on economic issues, but obviously, they do track the presidential approval rating and the presidential campaign. The CNBC poll done in late October, we had it 48-46 Trump ahead, and he's below 50% in the popular vote count, as Maria pointed out. And then the NBC, our final poll, released the last weekend before the election, showed it 49-49. And the RCP, Real Clear Politics, average of the polls that were public at the time had Harris by 0.1%. That's a toss-up. And again, you have a president elected winning the popular vote, but not with a majority of the popular vote. So it's very, very close. And the Real Clear Politics Electoral College map that they had turned out to be what the Electoral College turned out to be. And they were basing it on the average of state polls in the key states. Obviously, there were some that were obviously going to go Republican or go Democratic. But of the key states, when you factor that in, the pollsters were hitting it on the mark. The other part of it is we talked for months about the trends that favored Trump that didn't exist in 2020 or even 2016. For example, in the middle of the year, we pointed out that Party ID in 2020, Democrats had a 6-point advantage. At this point in time, in the middle of the year, and it stayed that way, Republicans had a 1-point advantage. That's a very significant shift from 2020 to 2024 in party identification. Secondly, we did a survey of Hispanic voters in July, and it showed a significant shift in their vote preference as well. And that came to pass on Election Day. Yes, Vice President Harris won Hispanic voters, but by nowhere near the margin. I believe 15 points lower than the margin that Joe Biden won in Hispanic voters in 2020. We also noted in July that compared to 2020, the Democratic Party's net image was 12 points worse than in 2020. And in terms of like where it was at its highest, which was 2008, it was 29 points worse than it was in 2008. And by the way, anybody who says, John McCain was a terrible candidate, he should have won that election. No, everything was stacked against him. And you have to kind of recognize the political environment at play. Political environment at play this time advantaged Republicans. We also had found in our focus groups that for the first time election, immigration was motivating to swing voters, not just to base Republicans. We also saw that the Democratic strength in 2020 and 2016 with younger voters had dropped precipitously as well. Our late July data showed that when Harris got in, the race basically reset to where it was before the Biden debate debacle. So there wasn't, it was a little bit of a sugar high, but it wasn't that big a sugar high. It was still a very close race. And one of the most important things is the right direction, wrong track question. And we saw that voters were similarly negative, and we highlighted this about the direction of the country as they were in 1992, 2008, 2016, and 2020. And those 4 elections all were presidential change elections. The only one that doesn't fit that mold was where voters were optimistic about the direction of the country but still made a change was in 2000. And I'll let you draw your own conclusions about how weak a candidate Al Gore was, that he's the only one with a sustained right direction number to lose, to have his party lose the presidency. And then finally, that Trump had clear advantages over Harris on the issues of inflation and the economy overall. So there are a lot of factors. Not only was the data right, but the story behind the data was also on the mark in terms of, now, again, let's not get carried away. It's, President Trump did not win election, or President-elect Trump did not win election by, an overwhelming margin. It was still a very close race. Right. This is a very polarized, deeply divided country, and things can change from election to election. So things could be very different in 2022. 2026. I'm living in the past. 2026. But that doesn't mean that's what will happen in 2028. I can remember in 1994, that was our second election cycle as a firm. And Republicans did great. And I remember consultants saying, Clinton's done. And we're like, no. This is the best thing that could have happened to him, because if he wants to survive, he's got to kind of figure out how to work with the Republican Congress and get a few things done that he can run on. And that's exactly what he did. So it's just hard. And of course, obviously, Trump can't be on the ballot in 2028. So whatever happens in Virginia next year and across the country, don't let it fool you about what may or may not happen, because it's way too early to tell.
Maria, did you feel like you had a good sense of where the country was based on polling this time? Did you feel misled by some of the numbers?
No, Glenn's right in terms of how close things were. And I think what that allowed both sides to do was to wish cast that it was close, but that your person was going to win, right? We heard it from both sides. I mean, Democrats were convinced that Kamala Harris was going to win. But it was for a couple of reasons that I do think, and I don't know if it was, again, that we were wishing or that we looked at data from before that we then misinterpreted, or it just didn't come to fruition. I think it just didn't come to fruition, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. In 2022, the issue of the economy was also top of mind for voters. In 2022, the right track, wrong track was very similar. It was bad for Democrats because, or seemingly bad for Democrats, because the majority of the country felt that the country was on the wrong track. In 2022, Biden's numbers were bad. But Democrats had a good midterm election in terms of, there was if you all remember, a huge expectation of a red wave, and it didn't happen. And so what was different from past midterm elections where there was sort of, one party takes over from the party that was in power, is the Roe v. Wade decision. And the Roe v. Wade decision, the Dobbs decision, was a huge factor in 2022 that really pushed, especially women, but not just women, Democrats, independents, and a lot of Republicans to say, hey, no, this is something actually that we think is really important. So we're going to vote for the party that is going to protect this right. And we were convinced as a party that tendency was going to not just repeat itself, but was going to be magnified, especially because there had been so many stories from the time that the Dobbs decision happened of the nightmares that Democrats talked about that would happen because of this decision, right? Women dying, women getting sick, women having to flee states that didn't have, the right to that kind of health care if they needed it. And the Democratic Party and the Kamala Harris campaign really leaned into that. And I think another thing that happened, if you all recall, in 2022, one of the reasons why I believe this became, the reproductive rights issue became really potent, was because Vice President Harris really led the effort, sort of under the radar. She went to college campuses, she went to minority communities, she went to, women all across the country. And we believe, and I think the numbers showed, that her efforts really did bring this issue to the fore. And so thinking that because she was the head of that effort in 2022, the fact that she was now the head of the ticket was going to yet again give us sort of the steam for this to be an issue that would override or perhaps be on the same level of concern and decision-making of an issue that the economy was. And that just did not happen. And I think that was a big miss from the Democrats. And I also think another thing happened that we also misinterpreted, thinking that it was going to be good for us, but perhaps giving the permission structure for voters to vote for the ballot initiatives is what I'm talking about. There were a lot of ballot initiatives, around in the states. And whereas before, that drew people to vote for the Democratic ticket, we thought that would do the same thing. And in fact, I think it did the opposite. It led people to say, well, if there's a ballot initiative in my state, I can protect my reproductive rights or, my daughter's reproductive rights if you're a father. But I'm not crazy about Kamala Harris, and so I'm not going to vote for her. And thinking that you're not, betraying the women in your family, whatever, right? And so I think that worked against us because in the majority of the states, well, frankly, I think in all of the states where these ballot initiatives were on the ballot, the majority of voters voted for them. It didn't pass in places like Florida because you needed 60%, and I think it got to 57 or 58, I think, right?
It was 57.
Yeah. And so I think that worked against us as well. And so, Democrats are going to go back. Like I said before, we're going to reflect. We're going to put our despair to purpose and look at what the opportunities are in the next 2 years. Because here's the other thing that's just really frustrating. And we saw this in focus groups and in polling as well. The Democratic economic policies are actually quite popular, taken on their own, right? When voters know about them. And this was another big miss in terms of the campaign and the messaging. A lot of voters didn't know what Democrats were for. But when they found out what the specific economic policies were, there was a huge shift in favor of the Democratic Party, in favor of Harris. And so you're right that there's going to be a big reckoning in terms of the spend, because how could you not, with that amount of money, how could you not mount? And I think the timing is a big issue here too, right? So many things that you can point to. But the fact that you had that amount of money and yet a lot of voters did not understand from an economic standpoint, which was the one issue that they were so focused on, what Democrats and what the Harris campaign would do for you is a big miss.
David, you want to get in on this?
Yeah, if you don't mind. So I remember in undergrad decades ago, I had a statistics course, and the professor says, I can make statistics say anything, right? And then he says, and I'm never wrong, because he has a margin of error, right? So with all due respect to all my pollster friends, they were wrong, so they're never wrong. For people like me that got on,
I got the data right here.
I know.
You can't say the
Remember,
polls,
you can make it
polls
say
were
anything
wrong.
you want, right? So for
I'm sorry.
within the
You're just
margin
not
of
right.
error, the 3 points.
There is
I
a
got-
question about people reading polls wrong and seeing numbers, and
Sure.
the numbers can be right, but if people are interpreting them wrongly, that's another.
Then there's the data, and then there's the little of a trend, right? So the last 2 days or the last weekend before the election, I looked at 10 different polls, and I'm sitting analyzing, go on TV to analyze based on these numbers, right? And I talked to 2 or 3 pollsters, friends, and I'm like, look, we're showing it tight. Statistically, it's tight, 2 points. But if we're looking at this trend in the last week, she got it. Right? That's not what they're putting publicly. She got it. Fine. I'm not going to out anybody, but she got it. She gets these numbers are showing us a trend are going her way. So when you have a polarized and that close of an election, where we knew it was going to be close, right? When we are within the margin of error, it's either we get to a point and say, then why are we polling altogether? Forget the polls. There's no reason for polling if all the polls are going to tell us that it's within the margin of error. Or no, we get to look at that margin and be able to determine something out of it. Otherwise, it becomes useless. So that's the point I had to make, because I was one who looked quite foolish on TV saying, no, according to these numbers and everybody I talked to, she got it, right? Fine. Now, and I hate to be picking on my friends here and colleagues, Maria, it's beyond just what the numbers and that spending didn't convince people. There were issues. My friends on the Democratic side needs to reckon that there were other important issues to the voter that you all didn't talk about, and that you concentrated on issues that were not outside of these areas, right? My in-laws are from Southwest Virginia, drive down an hour to Southwest Virginia, and I had this discussion with a lot of people over the last week, and sorry, Dobbs wasn't on the top 10, wasn't even close, right? Those were not the priorities. There were, unfortunately, things that scared them to vote that way as well, right? People look like me coming across the border was a scary thought, right? So you need to not only just be able to figure out how to get the message, but you got to be messaging about the right topics. And if you don't, unfortunately, the rest of America versus our metropolitan areas are not there.
I couldn't agree with you more. I agree.
Are not there.
I totally agree. And I don't want to filibuster here, but I do need to mention immigration, because one of the things that I'm really frustrated with, and I haven't really said this publicly yet,
Make some news.
Get ready, everybody, write it down.
I think that the administration and the Democratic Party made a huge mistake, and this goes to your point, David, because they refused to talk about immigration until it was way too late. And the reason why they did that is because they were concerned that if they talked about immigration in terms of how they felt about, not just how they felt about it, but what their values were and what they believed in and what they have legislated on and what they've talked about for years, which is a strong, smart border, as well as expanded legal pathways, especially for undocumented immigrants that have been here for decades and have roots in this country and have families and have started businesses. And if the Biden administration and Democrats were out there boldly leaning into, this is what we believe and this is what needs to happen because this is actually how you fix immigration, then I think we would be in a completely different position today. Unfortunately, they stepped back. They were afraid that if they talked about immigration, Republicans were going to paint them as open border. Well, guess what? Republicans did that anyway. And what that then left is a huge gap in spending on immigration. They completely outspended Democrats on immigration, and every single ad was people that looked like us and that sounded like
Haitians
us.
are eating cats and
Yes,
dogs.
exactly.
That, I mean,
Latinos are coming to rape your women and your children, and it was horrible stuff, and it worked. And we were caught flat-footed because we were unable and unwilling to be bold and to lean into what we know works, because we did see from polls that the majority of Americans, when you actually give them a choice between mass deportation or expanding legal pathways to let people like dreamers stay here legally and give them a pathway to citizenship, an earned pathway to citizenship, that pulls off the charts for independents, for Latinos, for even Republicans. But the fact of the matter is that when Vice President Harris, who believes in everything that I just said, started talking about it, and she did. She talked about smart border security, and she also talked about expanding legal pathways, but it was too late. Democrats started to talk way too much about just enforcement. They tried to out-Trump Trump, and you cannot out-Trump Trump. And so what voters remember is the scary ads. Donald Trump wants to close the border. Democrats haven't said anything, and I don't know what they stand for other than letting people come over and, overrun our cities. And that was a huge mistake on behalf of the Democratic Party.
Mark Short, I want to bring you in here because you've watched the Trump phenomenon at close hand for the last decade or so. And curious your thoughts about whether Donald Trump has a mandate. Is it a policy mandate? What did voters vote for a couple of weeks ago, and what are they going to get?
I think that sometimes we overcomplicate this, and sometimes we're paid to overcomplicate it. I think when the right track, wrong track is 30-70, it's pretty much right in front of your face. And I think that, we can have explanations that say that, they didn't actually hear our policy proposals. And the voters weren't smart enough to realize how really good our economy was. When voters know that you've had the highest inflation since the Jimmy Carter era, and they know the border's a mess, and they're telling you again and again our top two issues are the economy and the border, I don't think it's really hard is to understand what happened in this election cycle. As far as, the mandate, I think it was a more dramatic victory than I think a lot of people thought it would be, considering how polarized Trump is as far as top of the ticket. What I think is different this time, though, is on those two issues, border, economy, I don't know what the legislative agenda is. I think that what this administration is going to look to do is do executive action on the border and on trade. And so where I think there was an agenda before, and I think we've talked on this panel about having an overreach. When you come in, you have all three chambers. I mean, I think that we talk about as overreach. The reality is that in today's world, how polarized it is, it's kind of your window to get stuff done. And I don't mean that just from a Republican perspective. I started working on Capitol Hill during the Obama administration. If you guys remember when Obama came in with landslide and big majorities, it was in the first 2 years of his administration that he actually got Obamacare passed. It's when he passed his stimulus. And it wasn't until 2010 that they began to think maybe we got too far, and they failed on cap and trade. And there was no other major legislative accomplishment the next 6 years. He did other big things, but legislatively he didn't. And so I think as we look, to our administration, it was the first 2 years that we passed the tax cut relief. This time around, that's going to be the biggest issue, is just extending that. But I think as far as his primary goals when it comes to trade and the border, I think that there's going to be a lot of executive actions he takes. And I think that likely history will repeat itself, and that Democrats will have a very strong midterm cycle. I think Virginia will have, for you guys, a good election in next year. But I think that you'll see perhaps it's an overreach. I don't know that it's so much that. I think it's when you have your opportunity to get stuff done. But for this administration, I don't think they've articulated what they want to do with Congress. I think what they've articulated is what they want to do with executive action.
So that does.
Right? Except for Medicaid.
In what way?
The overreach.
No, I mean, look, that's just a whole different thing. I don't know what it is actually that, candidly, our party actually stands for from a philosophical perspective anymore.
Yeah.
I think that there was a day when we used to actually be the party that would stand up to Soviet aggression.
Right.
And now we're not. There was a day when we actually believed in free trade.
Yep.
And now we've adopted the labor union perspective that was the Democrat Party perspective on trade for decades. There was a time when we advanced rule of law. There was a time on social issues where we advanced and stood on life, and now our party is retreating from it and took it out of our platform. There's a time when we actually stood for fiscal responsibility, and today the party takes any mention of touching Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid in any way. Today we've reached for the first time in American history that if you add up our entitlements of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest on the debt, it is more than we bring in revenue.
Yep.
It's more we bring in revenue before we even start on discretionary spending, people. We're at $36 trillion. It used to be something our party spoke about taking control of. And right now, as far as what our mandate is, I think there are two issues that Trump has spoken about, and that is immigration and trade.
Tariffs.
So this does take the conversation down ballot, as Michael Toner was referencing earlier, and it is an interesting thing because Donald Trump will become president for the second time with 53 votes in the Senate in all likelihood. By modern standards, that's a pretty hefty margin, not by the Obama standards or historically, but recently that's a good chunk. You can lose a couple of votes there. He's going to have an extremely narrow majority in the House, about as narrow as it's been for the last couple of years, and we know what that's meant. But it is a more MAGA-friendly group. This is now a group of senators and congressmen who owe their political identities in large part to Donald Trump, and a lot of the critics are kind of fading away. Michael Toner, based on the races that you watched, what can we expect from this next Congress? Do you expect it to be a flurry of legislating early on, as Mark Short mentioned, as possibility in that first?
No, there won't be. That's the point I'm making. There won't be.
Right. And do you expect that they go along with just about everything Trump wants? And do they not fight these executive orders? Do they mostly confirm the cabinet picks?
Well, I think a couple things, and a couple people have touched on it, Mark touched on it. There is a great sense that you got to get what you can get done in the first 2 years, and that they're going to throw you out no matter what you do. So you might as well just get things done. Nancy Pelosi was actually a big believer of that during the first 2 years of the Biden administration. There was all this back and forth. Well, if we go this far on some of this legislation, we may get tossed out. And I think her response was, you're likely going to get tossed out anyway, marginal seat. So let's go ahead and get this stuff done. Right? I mean, I think that has really, I think, become a bipartisan norm. A lot of other norms have changed, but I think that one. So I think we're going to see a lot of judges confirmed, and they're gonna roll on that. If the Senate was in session, I believe, until 1:05 a.m. last night, doing procedural votes.
They're trying to do that now.
And they're going to keep going. This session is going to go till December 24th,
right.
If there are judges and so that's going to be one big emphasis, I think, of the administration in the next 2 years, and then reconciliation. right? This vehicle of getting major things done with just 50 votes. What Republicans would do to have 59 votes like the Democrats had in Obama's first 2 years. What a remarkable, it's just, sometimes I have to pause and think about what that would be like to have 59 votes. But I think reconciliation, either they're going to get a lot done through reconciliation or they're not going to have the votes. And I have no idea how it plays out, but that's going to be high drama. And historically, you really have to get a lot done. You say the first 2 years, it's really before the August recess and the end of this year, the end of 2024. You get into next year, people are already looking at the midterm landscape. So judges, reconciliation, I think Mark's absolutely right. This is like the new Smoot-Hawley era in terms of tariffs. Going to be a lot of tariffs. And the question is winners and losers on the tariff decisions. And trying to get as much accomplished through reconciliation. They definitely want to make the Trump tax cuts permanent, maybe extend them. And it's going to be really close votes on those. And some of these senators, are fairly independent on the Republican side. And so that's another wild card that we'll have to look at.
Glenn, I
Want
want
to just add, I'm sorry on that.
Yeah, please.
I do think that on the Senate, having 53 senators is a huge advantage for Trump. In our first year, y'all recall that McCain was sick and it was gone by the second half of the year. So we were operating with 51 senators. 53 is a huge difference, and it's not just judges. I think that there should probably be an expectation of additional Supreme Court opportunities for Trump to really cement his legacy with the court, because that's where you can get stuff done is in the Senate. When we passed tax cuts, we had an 18-seat majority in the House. 12 Republicans defected on that bill because of SALT. You're going to have now, when this is said and done, roughly 220 House Republicans, and 3 will quickly be taking the administration. Mike Johnson is going to have no margin.
Yeah.
And so to get taxes extended, it's going to have to be done on budget reconciliation, which everybody focuses on the Senate, but the House is going to have to pass a budget.
Yep.
And that's going to be much more difficult than people anticipate right now. It is not going to be easy. And people assume, you have a Republican president, House, and Senate, that'll get done. Passing a budget with these sorts of deficits is not going to be easy for Mike Johnson. And that's going to be an enormous task in the year ahead.
Glenn, I want to swing the conversation to you for a moment on this, because John Carl, my colleague who was supposed to be in this chair today, he is down at Mar-a-Lago. He reported this morning that Trump's attitude toward the confirmations of his cabinet picks was, you better support this, and if you don't, you're going to get a primary opponent, and Elon Musk is going to fund that opponent. That's the attitude that's emanating publicly, perhaps privately, from from Trump world right now. They won. They have this mandate they view it as, and they're going to muscle through. Doesn't matter whether you like their picks or not. I'd imagine certainly on executive orders and defending those, but I would imagine on legislation it's going to be a similar attitude. It's not going to be, let's negotiate with the SALT holdouts. It's going to be, you better do this or we are going to steamroll you. Is that view held widely among Republicans in elected office right now, or are the folks that are going to be up again in 2 years, are they already thinking, wow, I better stay on Trump's good side, or is there kind of more independence at this point?
Well, first thing I'd like to do in terms of observations is there's no president who's ever been elected who said, yeah, you can do what you want with my picks for the cabinet. They've all said you better pass them, and they've told their party that you got to get in line.
The Elon Musk threat was a bit different.
Yeah. Oh no. There's no question that that is a higher level of saying you better get this done. You better fall in line. The money that can be spent. And look, I've never seen a politician as powerful with his own base as Donald Trump. And elected Republicans, I should say, are aware of that and are concerned about that. They don't want to be primaried because the way the seats are drawn these days, that's pretty much the easiest way you can to lose. It's much harder to lose a general election. There aren't that many competitive House seats, for example. Now, and in the Senate, there's only 3 split delegations, which is the lowest ever. 3-party split delegations since the start of the Republican and Democratic parties. And so, with in other words, 1 Democratic senator, 1 Republican senator. So states tend to, there's not that many changeovers, even though this Senate election, there were, a decent number. There were still 4, unlike in the last 2 elections, Democrats who won re-election or won election, because 2 opens and 2 incumbents, despite the fact that Trump won their state. So there's just the competition is more from within the parties now than from the other party in a lot of these elections. So yeah, that's definitely going to be something that weighs on elected officials, Republicans, I should say, especially those who aren't particularly, part of the MAGA movement. The MAGA movement voter Republicans, they'll easily vote for them. But there's certainly going to be others who say, thank God Matt Gaetz dropped out, so I didn't have to make the decision about whether to support this nominee, or whether to risk the primary and all the fundraising that goes, it's going to go against me and all of that. So, yeah, it's definitely something they're going to be thinking about as they make these decisions.
Maria, as the Democrats kind of regroup in this moment, you touched on some of this about the kind of reticence to talk about some issues in a more direct way. One thing I've heard from some Democrats in the last couple of weeks is that one thing that they feel like they need to fix, in a way, is the way that way that interest groups are relying on purity. That elected officials get these questionnaires, you got to fill out all these things, and unless you check the right box on everything, they're going to primary you, or they'll be behind your opponent, and that's stopping them, in their view, from offering a kind of clarity that Americans can more broadly get behind.
In terms of the issues that they represent?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. And I think moving into this cycle, there is going to be a lot more clarity from Democrats. But I think right now, Democrats feel pretty confident that their positions were actually the right ones, that their economic policies were the right ones, because frankly, they are the ones that, and again, this goes to the frustration that it didn't penetrate, because it's Democrats' economic policies, the ones that actually help the vast majority of working class and middle class Americans. And what's so ironic is that, and I just saw this morning, there was a rule from the Biden administration to try to increase overtime pay. And Republicans just shot it down. And the issue of overtime pay is one of the things that Donald Trump ran on. And it's one of the things that MAGA working class voters were championing, that Donald Trump was a champion of that, and that Democrats were not doing anything about it. And this just now happened, right? It's actually the Biden administration rule, if it had passed, that would have given additional and extended overtime pay for working class Americans, and it's Republicans who have now completely killed it. And so this is sort of the frustration, the dichotomy, the miss, if you will, that Democrats are contending with, and that they are going to essentially try to better the way that we not just message, but the platforms in which we message. This was another big miss for Democrats, right? And I think it had a lot to do with the timing of the campaign. 107 days for Vice President Harris I believe now, was never going to be enough time, given the polarity of where we are. The right has done a magnificent job, a masterful job of infiltrating a lot of the new media, social media, podcasts, Instagram, social chats, WhatsApp groups, Facebook, Snapchat, all of these areas where a lot of the young people are, a lot of Latinos, a lot of minorities, a lot of voters of color, a lot of men, and this was clearly the manosphere bro election, right? And this is where they live. And Democrats did start spending a lot of money in communicating in these platforms, but it happened way too late. Republicans invested millions of dollars in bringing influencers to create content to, frankly, disseminate a lot of misinformation and disinformation and conspiracy theories in these social media platforms years ago, They've been operating in these platforms for years. And so that is something that the Democratic Party is going to really look at and hopefully create an infrastructure that is our own, that will help fight the misinformation and disinformation that is out there, that is rampant still even today,
So,
that will focus on policies that we really want to
Are you
get together.
blaming the candidate more or the voters more for her loss?
I'm not blaming the voters. I'm blaming, I think I'm just saying that the party was lacking in how we communicated our message and how we combated the misinformation and disinformation. I'm not blaming the voters at all.
David Ramadan, as a former state lawmaker, what does this next period look like from the state and even local level? Being in the minority in Congress doesn't give you a lot of power. They'll have a megaphone, there'll be a new DNC chair, but I've got to think a lot of the most intriguing challenges to what Trump and his administration try to do are going to come from states, from governors, from mayors. What's your sense of what this looks like, this period for Democrats from the state or local level on a range of issues, education, abortion rights, you name it?
A lot of unknowns to start. So let's take education as an example. And I was looking up earlier, because I'm not into wrestling, but I was looking up some wrestling terms. So the question is Linda McMahon going to be the heel, which I understand that means the villain, and slam down the Department of Education totally for a full fall? Or is this going to be just, I don't know, cut couple departments? There are opportunities, there are challenges. I'm a conservative, always will be, no longer a Republican. I'm homeless because the Republican Party is not my party anymore, because that's what we stand for. But I still like to see some changes happening in education. If they move the focus of education by giving the states more power is one thing. Getting rid of the Department of Education altogether and making it free for all is another thing, right? Sending the money for the states to decide how to spend it, I'm good with that, right? But if you're just going to cut off the money and not give it to the states or start picking winners and choosers who gets it, I'm not good with that. Some of the opportunities would be innovation on state level. I mean, Commonwealth like mine, Virginia, is already ahead on charter schools and ahead on innovation and ahead on online education. They'll be fine, and they'll use that. But even within the state, it'll differ between Nova and Rova, Nova and the rest of Virginia, right? Nova would be fine, rest of Virginia is not. If you cut about 8 to 10% of our K-12 funding comes from federal government today for an average school. If you cut 8 to 10% out of a school in Fairfax County, you're going to hear a lot of people screaming, but guess what? They're not going to lose a single child. They'll be able to manage without the 8-10%. If you cut 8 to 10% out of Southwest Virginia, you may need to close that school altogether. They already have holes in the ceilings that they can't plug in. So there'll be huge differences between one area and another, depending on what the government does. And then the question becomes, as Mark is absolutely right, most of this is going to be done by executive action. So if by executive action you go close half of those programs that are coming from the Department of Education, then how do you plan long term? Do you plan for it to be only for 4 years and you get back? Or do you plan for it that this is permanent? You get to change the structure of your education, because that is state level, right? Voting is another. Everybody talks about voting and election integrity. It's done by the states. Mm-hmm. It's not done by the federal government. And it's done on county levels. If you make drastic changes on direction from the federal government, how's that going to affect us on state level? So there are a lot of unknowns. There are opportunities, but there are more challenges probably than there are opportunities.
Mark, what does it mean to have this Trump coming in for the second term? In one level, he's learned a lot of lessons. People around him have learned how the process works. That the first year in particular, my recollection of it was quite chaotic on the legislative front. And there were times where people were already writing off the legislative agenda and saying he can't do anything. And then you chalked up some major victories. It kind of took a little while to get the sea legs. But you also point out this isn't teed up all these bills that are going to happen in the first 100 days, that most of the big things are executive orders. Is your sense that that's still evolving behind the scenes, or is this just going to be kind of the haphazard nature of Trump governance, that you won't really know what the agenda is until it's out there?
I think if you're expecting it to be not chaotic, Rick, you're going to be deeply disappointed. I think that chaos is just his operating model, and it'll play out in different ways. I think that, legislatively, let's keep in mind that I think that failing to repeal Obamacare was a big disappointment in the first year. But that was a campaign promise Republicans had made ever since 2010. Mm-hmm. We won the House on that promise in 2010. We won the Senate on that promise in 2014. So for years, it had been a Republican promise that we would get rid of government-run health care. And so naturally, when you come into administration, that's what you do. But it's also important to keep in mind that we were inaugurated roughly January 20th. The House and Senate gets inaugurated January 3rd or 4th. The House and Senate already moved that legislation before we were even sworn into office. And so there was a lot of division there that I think we learned lessons when we passed the tax reform about how to do it better. But part of that, you're right, was playing catch up to where the House and the Senate already were. I'm not sure, as I mentioned, what the legislative necessarily agenda is other than to extend the tax cuts, which I think is going to have a lot of challenges in the year ahead. But I do think that you're going to continue to see chaos, but there's no doubt he feels that he better understands the way this town operates and what he wants to do. And I think he's looked to do that more through executive team actions than through partnering with Congress.
Michael Toner, after every election, obviously, both parties, lots of candidates learn lessons. What are the takeaways from where you sit at the intersection of money and politics, studying it, that you say, well, here's a model that works, here's something that doesn't work, that the parties need to learn going forward?
Well, first of all, what's terrific about presidential elections, there's always innovations. And you think of emerging technologies and opportunities for presidential candidates to meet voters where they are. In many ways, this was the first podcast election. Don't think that's going to change going forward. In some ways, it was the first TikTok election. Now, we don't know the future of TikTok in this country. We'll have to see how all that plays out. But when you look back in time, almost every presidential election has an innovation of that nature. And then there'll be ones that 2 years from now or 3 years from now we're not even thinking about right now. And that's the exciting part of the experimental side of presidential politics. When you raise $1.5 billion or $1 billion, you have the money and the resources to go and experiment in different ways. So that's one thing I really like about talking about presidential elections. The other thing is when you look at these two fields, because people are always running for president. The starting gun starts January 21st. You look on the Democratic side, there are a lot of prominent governors who might have run if Joseph Biden had withdrawn after the midterm, and probably are going to run in 2028. You think of Gavin Newsom, Josh Shapiro, Maryland's very prominent governor, Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan. Really a gubernatorial bench there. And then on the Republican side, it's just taking a look at the money and politics side of it and just the party, it's J.D. Vance and everybody else. It's the J.D. Vance lane and it's everybody else. And that's what's going to be fascinating. And again, the gun starts on January 21st. Right, and getting out there and raising your profile and helping people in the midterm election, helping people in the Virginia, New Jersey elections. But when you look at the potential field to succeed President Trump, it's Vance and everybody else. It's Ted Cruz.
I have a unique perspective that Donald Trump doesn't usually set up his vice president for succession.
But won't have to vote on the next term.
I'm not so confident that 4 years from now, J.D. Vance will be in the driver's seat for the party.
I think there's a J.D. Vance lane, and then there's the other lane, maybe. And it's the Trump lane and the non-Trump lane. That's how I see the GOP field.
Glenn, what do you think of that? Is that a good assessment at this very early stage? Is the Republican Party the MAGA party going forward, or is there something else that's likely to emerge? Obviously, there's been a lot of success with Trump in this past election, and obviously in 2016.
Yeah, look. My first vote I ever cast was 1980 for Ronald Reagan. I consider myself still a Reagan conservative, but I do think that the Republican Party has become is now the MAGA party. And I think Trump's win cemented that. I don't know that it would have been different had he lost. But because when you look at where voters are, and I think Mark touched on this earlier, we used to be anti Russia, we used to be pro-free trade, and those days are gone. Doesn't mean there aren't some free traders. There aren't some saying, yeah, we need to stand up for Ukraine because that's the right thing to do. And Russia is just land hungry and evil government led by a dictator who likes to kill people. There are, yes, it's going to be Vance. And I personally like Mark and his boss, former boss, Vice President Pence. But I have to believe that Vance is going to be a lot more doing what Trump wants. So he's a little bit more likely to be supportive.
Do you realize how much for roughly 4 full years the media mocked Pence for doing everything Trump wanted?
True.
Oh, yeah, no, I know.
And now the narrative is, oh, man, he surely wasn't loyal to Trump.
Well, Trump
Because he just decided
turned
to
on him
follow
like
He did one thing.
one thing.
Right.
And it was the constitutionally correct thing.
Of course it was. Of course
Pesky
it was.
Constitution.
Yeah.
man.
Of course it was. But
And remember, the U.S. Constitution is undefeated and untied. So, your boss did the right thing.
well,
Yes, he did.
But I mean, it does raise an interesting question because it didn't, Pence was as loyal as they come, and the moment he wasn't, he gets tossed overboard by the entire movement. It raises questions about the durability of a movement if it's tied to one person and that person's whims. No, I mean where do you see, Mark, the party going next?
look, I have no doubt that that Trump has cemented his grip on the party. I don't know that we know what it's going to be 10 years from now or what it's going to be as far as the next nominee. My point to Glenn is not meant to be dismissive. It's just simply that if the belief is that because Vance stays close to Trump, he'll be better positioned, it's a matter of time before something happens. And so I just think that it's going to be an up for grabs in 4 years from now. I don't view that J.D. Vance is going to be a front runner for that.
Yeah, but I mean, to be fair to both me and to Michael, I think Michael put it very well, which is there's the Trump lane, which he thinks and I think will be filled by Vance. And then there's a different lane.
Everybody
and we don't know who else is
And
going
I agree that this moment. I just don't think you can say that from 4 years from now because there's going to be.
You got to say something. I mean,
There's going to be change.
these people didn't come for nothing.
All that traffic down on 95. You get
Well, we learned how much Halloween candy costs.
That's right. We did learn that. We got about 5 minutes left, but I want to get some more moving forward thoughts. Maria, where do you see the interesting movement now from the Democratic Party? Who are the people you're watching or the trends that you watch next?
So the next big move for the Democrats is going to be the race for the DNC chair. And as someone who is a creature of the party, I'm a current DNC member, but my very first job in politics was at the DNC when Ron Brown was chairman back in the 90s. And it was, we were an opposition party. It was during George H.W. Bush's presidency. And the DNC is a very different animal when you are the party of opposition than when you are in the party of power. When you're in power, you get to appoint a chair. When you're in opposition, you actually have to run for the chair. And so that's where we are now. There are names that are now emerging.
Who's going to win?
That is a very good question, Rick. I have some thoughts, but there's some interesting names. Rahm Emanuel apparently is interested. Martin O'Malley, former governor of Maryland. Ken Martin, who is a current chair of the Minnesota State Party. There are a couple of Latinos who have been mentioned, Chuck Rocha, Maria Teresa Kumar. And Nina Turner has been mentioned. So people are starting to put their names in the hat for this, but they actually have to mount a campaign. They have to raise money, they have to mount a campaign, and their only constituency is DNC members, which also makes it difficult because DNC members, I think, are going to look to somebody who knows the party, who knows the infrastructure, who knows the ins and outs of the party. But I believe, and I think a lot of DNC members also believe, that you kind of need some new blood, some new ways of thinking, some outsiders. So I don't know where the balance is going to tip because DNC members, I think, will also be concerned if it's somebody who doesn't really know a lot about the party, doesn't have institutional knowledge, but they can certainly surround themselves with people that have that. So It also, I think, is going to depend on after, the postmortems, after all of the internal analyses. What has to emerge is, what do we need now? What type of person do we need now? What is the strength of that person that we need? They have to be a great fundraiser. They have to be a great communicator. They have to understand the sort of new environment of the media that I just mentioned before, right? As well as be strong on traditional media. You have to understand the ins and outs of organizing. So I think this is going to be one of the most interesting next steps for the Democratic Party that will indicate where the party is going to go to next.
David, where do you see the pendulum swinging for Democrats? Do you think it's more on the progressive side, more on the establishment, mainstream moderate side? Where do you see them going next for leadership, either DNC chair or 2028?
Look, I don't know the internal of their party. I mean, I'm not a Democrat, but I can tell you where they should go. Okay, if they look at the map that we saw in this election, you look and the map is red across the country, except in the spotted blue areas. And what they need to go is where this red part of America is. Otherwise, they're not going to keep winning elections. They're going to keep losing. So that means the centrist part needs to win more, and they need to go back to kitchen table issues and far away from what a lot of my friends on the left are trying to do. The Republicans already went MAGA. The good old party is gone, right? It's going to be a very powerful MAGA party. I don't know, at some point they should change the name as well, because it's no longer the Republican Party, it's Trump's party. Now, had he lost this election, maybe there would have been a little swing back, but at this point, it's 70, 80%, and beyond him, nobody knows where the party's going to be. But Democrats still have a chance to come back to, because their left field is 10, 15% of their party, right? Not more. But they've been very vocal and very strong, and they pulled the party toward very left extreme positions in the last few years that cost them, or partly cost them, this election, if not all of it, right?
Perception-wise.
Perception-wise, reality-wise, perception is reality here. So they need to swing back to the middle, otherwise they're going to be in trouble.
All right. I want to thank our panelists for simulating a fascinating conversation. Thank you to the Center for Politics for hosting this, and thank you all for being here. It was fun.
Thanks, buddy.
They're both political contributors at CNN, and Paul Begala appears frequently on CNN's The Situation Room, as well as other programs on all CNN networks, and I didn't realize how many there were until recently. India has a separate CNN, who knew? Paul was formerly, as I mentioned, co-host of Crossfire, CNN's political debate program. Was it Tucker Carlson who was the other one with you?
Tucker and the late Bob Novak and the not yet late James Carville.
Yeah. We'll tell him you said that.
Oh, yeah.
No, but he's been getting a lot of TV time.
I know,
that's for sure.
He's doing great.
All right. Paul first entered the national political scene after the consulting firm that he and fellow Democratic strategist James Carville started, Carville and Begala, which helped President Bill Clinton, more than helped. You all plus George Stephanopoulos were the campaign, helped President Bill Clinton get elected in 1992. Paul has been in various academic roles over the years, including at the University of Virginia Center for Politics, where he is one of our scholars. He has authored several best-selling books and is currently affiliated with Georgetown University. And his son, Charlie, is at Wahoo. Was an intern at the center and did all kinds of things at the Center for Politics. So we appreciate it very much. Scott Jennings is the founding partner of Run Switch Public Relations, as well as his work on CNN. I told him he deserved combat pay. He's frequently the only Republican on a panel, and so they all aim their fire at him, and he defends himself very well. But I can only imagine what your email is like.
It's not pretty.
It's not pretty. No. Believe it or not, even commentators like me get really nasty stuff.
I make it out better than Morning Joe right now, though.
And they deserve every one of them, every single one of them. Scott's career has taken him across the country as part of 4 presidential campaigns and numerous federal and state races. He served in key roles in both of President George W. Bush's campaigns before becoming special assistant to the president in 2005, serving under top Bush strategist Karl Rove, who's also been with us a number of times. So we're really looking forward to this. We know how busy both of you are. We appreciate your taking the time. And it's a car ride all the way over from CNN in D.C. They split it, right? You all split them because Begala's cheap. I know that from his sons. He's very, very cheap. Anyway, please welcome Paul Begala and Scott Jennings.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you very much. It is great. This is the first time I've been on this stage since Crossfire got canceled. But it was on this stage that I interviewed some of the most horrible people in the world. Jerry Falwell, Ted Nugent, Christopher Hitchens, and sat with Carville and Tucker and Novak. And this is not Crossfire, okay? This time I'm on with a really good guy. And this is a mission against interest as a loyal Democrat. He's a loyal Republican. Scott's a really good guy. And what I want to do, let's talk about the election a little bit. And we'll go through the election, I promise. But there's been so much talk about that what I really want to do first is celebrate a life in politics. Because I love Larry and I love the center. And I'm honored to be a part of it. Only in America could you be a scholar at a university you could have never gotten into. But I have a smart kid, Charlie, and he interned for Larry, and that's kind of, Larry took pity on the old man and allowed me to affiliate with the center. And so I love what they do, and it all starts from the top with Larry, who gave us this mantra: politics is a good thing. Yes, it is. It is. Well, to believe that now is a countercultural position. Yeah. And I believe it and I celebrate it. And it's one of the reasons I asked Larry to make time for Scott and I to visit at this conference, because Scott's one of the good guys in this business. We probably disagree about 94% of the time. That's a good thing. Politics is a good thing. I never learned anything from a vigorous agreement. I want to be with people who have different ideas from me. And I think, Scott, let me just start with your bio. Yeah. Because I think part of what makes you so good at what you do is that you're from somewhere. Dawson Springs, Kentucky.
Yeah.
Hometown of Steve Beshear, the former governor, father of the current governor.
Yep, the most influential town in Kentucky.
It is.
It has Steve Beshear and Scott Jennings.
Yeah, not in that order now. Steve is retired.
I know.
So it's about 3,200 people when you're growing up. It's about 2,400 now.
Yeah.
It's in Hopkins County, which Bill Clinton won in a landslide, and then Trump just won in a quadruple landslide.
Right.
Classic Kentucky. Tell me, what was it like growing up there, and how has being a Hopkins County, Dawson Springs guy informed your commentary and your analysis and your participation in politics?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me here, and thank you for listening to us today. I totally agree with the assessment. Politics is a good thing. It's a good career. Being a political operative is not a bad thing. It's not a dirty word. It's a positive thing. The country runs on politics. And so we need to encourage more people to go into it. Growing up in West Kentucky in Hopkins County was amazing. My dad, who was at various times a factory worker and a garbage man and other things, was a huge Democrat. My grandfather was a Democrat elected official.
Wow.
And my earliest memories of politics are riding around in his station wagon helping people like Wendell Ford, former Senator Carol Hubbard, former congressman, and other Democratic Party luminaries. And when I became old enough to vote in the 1996 election, in Kentucky we have partisan primaries. And so I went down to the county or the city clerk's office to vote. We have 3 precincts in Dawson. They all vote at the same table. It's about this size. And I go in and the lady's like, "Oh, goodness, Scott Jennings is here." So she's going through the roll. She's looking for me and she says, "Well, I see your dad and I see your granddad, but are you sure you registered?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, but you're looking at the wrong list." And then she closes the book and pulls out the one sheet of Republicans and goes down the list and looks at me over her glasses and says, "Does your grandfather know what you've done?" And that's when I became a real Republican, because by the time I got back up to the high school, my dad was already there and the principal was calling me into the office. Wow. And that was 1996. Fast forward to 2015, when my dad was the first, maybe 14, was the first person who told me that Donald Trump was going to be the next president.
Wow.
And me, of course, being one of the smart people, "Oh, Dad, come on, you're ridiculous," you know. But my dad was the biggest Bill Clinton guy. Loved Bill Clinton. We were a Bill Clinton household, big Democrat family, and just that was his guy. And there's no bigger Trump guy in Western Kentucky maybe anywhere, than my dad. That's the evolution.
Right.
Working class Democrats in rural Western Kentucky evolving into becoming Republicans over time. Didn't happen exactly overnight, but pretty darn close. And so my education in politics was watching this evolution unfold in my own family. And then when I finally got into the business in 2000, after leaking envelopes for Mitch McConnell in 1996. But my first campaign was 2000, working for George W. Bush. And I've continued to watch this evolution, and it's been an incredible thing to see people and geographical locations completely turn upside down. I mean, we're living through, I think, a once in 100-year sort of evolution of the two parties. Certainly my party is going through it, and it's been pretty remarkable, and it has certainly driven some people out, but it's also brought some people in. And watching how this unfolds over the next few years is going to be really fascinating.
Well, I want to get to more of your bio, but since you're on that, I spent the last several days of the election traveling the country with President Clinton, like I used to back in the day, and it was just great. And he always teaches me so much. He carried Kentucky twice, and he loves Kentucky. And
the last Democrat to carry it.
Yeah. We went all over the country. We did not go to Kentucky, but we went all over the country. And I don't know how many rallies we did. And he talked about one thing, the economy. Mm-hmm. He's for everything else. He's for fixing Dobbs, and he's for transgender rights. He's for everything. But he kind of had this crazy notion that when the price of eggs is twice of what it was when your party came into office, people are going to be angry with you. Right? And so he tried to make the case on the economy for his party. And he's just one guy now, and he's semi-retired. But is that what's driving this? Is it that, because I watched, you did too, we watched the election very carefully, and Mr. Trump's economic policy was, I've seen Arnold Palmer naked. Okay, I'm sorry, he didn't really seem to bring anything. He had good ads. He had a really well-run campaign, but he himself seemed to not talk about the economy or anything. It was. I think I'd rather be electrocuted than eaten by a shark. Like, okay, yes, sir. But so I understand the aversion to Democrats, but tell me how that came about, and then also the attraction to Trump. It is puzzling to a lot of people, because I grew up in a very middle-class family too, in a very small town. Tom DeLay was my congressman. So I was a contrarian too. That's why I became a Democrat. But how do working class people look at a guy who was chauffeured to a private academy as a child and potty trained on a gold toilet and say, that's my guy?
I think in this election, Trump had something very powerful working in his favor, and that is his retrospective job approval was going up every day. When he left office, his job approval was probably in the 30s. Mm-hmm. But by the time Election Day 2024 rolled around, in most national surveys, and certainly in the swing states, his job approval was over 50%.
Right.
So after having thought about it and living through the Biden years, people decided this wasn't so bad after all. So it absolved him in some ways of having to make too detailed of an argument, right, because all you really had to do was say, there's two presidencies to compare, mm-hmm, and don't you like mine better than these people? And right, people basically decided yes. The AP VoteCast statistics that have come out on the exit polling bear this out. His job approval went up substantially in every single swing state and among virtually every demographic. And so he had the benefit of people remembering, the economy was better, right, prices were lower, I didn't feel the economic anxiety that I feel today. So that was super helpful. I think the other thing that's going on, though, is really cultural. Mm-hmm. And I think that he speaks to people who, two kinds of people. One, people who used to be Democrats but feel culturally disconnected from the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And two, people who don't feel connected to either party, never have been terribly interested in or involved in politics, but culturally believe or hear something in his message that appeals to him. There's something about the anti-institutional, anti-government in some ways, the anti-cancel culture, the anti-woke message. There are scores of people, young men in particular, mm-hmm, who responded to that. And it is apparent, if you look at the data following this election, that he won the election on the strength of low and no propensity voters. Mm-hmm. People, that was their turnout strategy the whole time. Turn out people who just don't normally participate in elections and don't feel like either Democrats or Republicans.
I call it empty the deer stands.
Yeah.
As an avid deer hunter, right? That's what he did.
He had
emptied the deer
a
stands.
he had a strategy to empty the deer stands,
Right.
and the Harris campaign had a strategy to give them camouflaged hats.
That's better than insulting them, which is what my party was doing before.
But I think it was insulting because I think what people like that heard in that was, after all this time and all the things you've said and all the condescension, you're just going to give me a hat and call it a day. And I think it backfired, to be candid with
Really?
you. And I think Trump figured this out. They knew it early, but particularly with young and men, they knew they had something. And it's not unlike what Obama was able to do. This is the main similarity between Trump and Obama. They both had the capacity to talk to a pool of people that only they could reach and motivate.
Right.
Trump could turn people out that weren't available to Harris, and Obama could turn people out that weren't available to his
And
opponent.
probably weren't available to a more conventional Republican. Is that right?
Absolutely, 100%. People during the election said, oh my gosh, Nikki Haley will be winning by 20 points. I'm just not sure that's true because Trump turns people out that only vote for Trump. Look at what happened in some of the states where Democrats won Senate races. It wasn't crossover voting. It was people who showed up and only voted for Trump, and they didn't vote in any other election.
Wow.
He has a unique group that only responds to him, and I'm
Well, that
I'm
also
not certain
explains
another Republican could have done
It
it.
explains the poor performance by Republicans in midterms,
Yes,
both times after,
midterms,
2018,
off-year elections, special elections.
Right.
Democrats have regular high-propensity voters. Republicans now have irregular, low-propensity, non-politically connected voter. It's actually, for my entire political operative career, it's been the opposite.
Right.
Now, high turnout elections help Republicans. Low turnout elections help Democrats. It's totally opposite.
Right. And I think a lot of the consultant class hasn't figured that out yet.
Nope.
I did see, I was traveling with President Clinton, went to Savannah. This is only a few days before the election. And the guy who was running the state for Kamala was at our rally. It was a big rally, and Clinton was doing great, and everybody's happy. But I pulled the guy aside, because I used to do this for a living, and I want to know. And that was the question I asked him. I said, is Trump turning out his low propensity whites? And the guy got real quiet and said, oh, yeah. And we got back in the car, and I told the president, we're in some trouble. Because I've worked in Georgia, and it's those guys, and they're all guys, statistically speaking.
There was a skepticism that this would work because the Republicans this year, under the direction of the Trump campaign leadership, Chris LaCivita and Susie Wiles, decided to throw out the old turnout playbook,
Right.
which was all based on volume. Make as many calls as you can, knock on as many doors as you can. Well, how many people did you actually talk to? I don't know, but we tried a lot. They threw that whole playbook out. I was part of it for many, many cycles.
Right.
And they just decided to focus everything on a smaller pool, but higher quality contacts, and they did it. And everyone was skeptical, and there were lots of reporting during the election that, Republicans say they have heard nothing from the Trump ground game.
Right.
Well, of course, you're a regular voter. They weren't talking to you. They spent everything on talking to these low and no propensity voters, and it absolutely worked. And not to mention, it's not just low propensity whites. It was Hispanic men, African American men. They saw a deluge of working class voters come towards them in a way that no Republican has seen in recent memory. That their ground game and the way they decided to do it absolutely worked, and they were totally vindicated after a whole campaign of people kind of sneering at it or laughing at it.
Well, let me come back to the 3 or 4 careers you've had. Political operative, White House official, media commentator. Let's first off, how are they different? How are they similar? Having gone through this white hot experience on set at CNN every other day, or every day.
Well, my current gig is totally different than when we worked in the White House. You can't do anything. Everybody's telling you no all the time. In TV, you have to be, a little more provocative. In the government, you're trying not to be provocative. In the media, you're trying to be a little more provocative. But the similarity is, I feel like in both cases, and I think maybe you feel this way too, is that we're a vital part of the political process and that we're serving in the larger political ecosystem in a meaningful way. I mean, I think the debates we have on television actually are extremely instructive, and they're also help shape events and shape how people see the news that they're getting. My political operative career was really an amazing journey, starting in 2000 and with President Bush, then Governor Bush, and then going on to the 2004 reelect. From 2000 to 2004, I didn't know what losing was like. We were winning all the time.
Yeah.
And then 2006 rolled around, and that's when we started losing a little. We lost in 06, we lost in 08. We won in 10, and we won in 14. We left some meat on the bone in the Senate. But I also, during this time, was working for Mitch McConnell. I was a senior political aide to him for all of his campaigns dating back to 1996, as I mentioned, when I licked envelopes. And so I was kind of
as they used to say in Kentucky, nobody likes Mitch except the voters. I never lost. And he was always, as President Bush might say, he was always misunderestimated.
Absolutely. And learned, I mean, he's my mentor.
Yeah.
And for those of you considering a political career, having a mentor who's highly successful like that is a game-changing experience.
Right. So what did he teach you?
Focus. McConnell, if there's one thing I've ever learned from him, it's focus. A lot of people in politics chase every rabbit down every hole. They read the comments, never read the comments.
Right.
They are easily distracted. They're more focused on fleeting items than overall strategic goals. And if there's one thing I've learned from him, it's focus on strategic goals. How are we going to win this election? How are we going to pass this bill? How are we going to confirm this nominee? How many of what we need do we actually have? Not how many do we think we have? And so focus and not losing control of your emotions. I don't know if any of you have read the new Michael Tackett book on McConnell, but I have a quote in the foreword in which I said I thought his greatest strength was the ability to divorce negative emotional situations from strategic decision making. Wow. He doesn't really hold grudges. He doesn't really get overly consumed with personal anger. He just, like they always say the best golfers, that they forget the shot they just hit immediately, whether it was good or bad. He's the same way. He never is dwelling on something in the past. It's always focused on the next thing. And so that's what I learned from him in his campaigns. And on top of that, I think message discipline. If you look at his campaigns, they found the thing that they knew would work, and it is relentless. Absolute, being relentless on what you know is going to work to move people in your direction, whether that's a negative attack or something positive on yourself.
And for students who are thinking about getting into this, I can't tell you how important that is. And it's easy to say, and it's so hard to do, because in politics, everything is coming at you, and people want comment on everything. And people grab you in the rope line and say, why aren't you talking about historic preservation in Kentucky? Because, well, we've got this wonderful history,
And because of people are constantly dragging on you to comment on everything, there is a tendency by some candidates to become pundits. They forget that they're candidates. They want to become, and I tell people all the time, you're not a pundit, you're a candidate. You're not a commentator. You don't have to comment on everything.
Right.
And commenting on everything likely means you're not commenting on the thing that you need to be focused on. And it also means you might be getting yourself in trouble with some people you're not even thinking about. And so that is, if you look at sort of what McConnell does, he's not on cable every night. He's not on the Sunday shows every Sunday. He does it when it suits him and when it benefits him and what he's trying to accomplish. And I think actually that's a key difference in certain kinds of politicians these days, people who are here to legislate and people who are here to effectively be famous. Those are two different things.
I saw this with your old boss in the White House, President Bush, George W. Bush. He was my governor in Texas, who is hugely underrated as a political strategist.
Yes.
And your friend and mentor, and my friend now, Karl Rove, used to be rivals at best, but now we're friends because we're old and time passes, and he's a great guy. We've become friends. Just saw him last week. But Governor Bush is really, really good at this. And if you get him, you know this, but if you get him off camera, off the record, he will give you an analysis of the Pennsylvania Senate race that'll knock your socks off. Okay, I mean, he's absolutely a great political strategist. If you turn that camera on and you ask him about strategy, he was so disciplined about this, he would never become a pundit. He would say, well, you need to ask Rove about that. It's not what I do. I'm the president or I'm the governor. I'm just trying to help these children get a better education. And he never took the bait, but it's so hard, and particularly for those of you who may be Democrats, I know our party symbol is supposed to be the donkey. It should be the largemouth bass. Because we snap at any shiny object that moves. Oh, bam! And it's always got a hook in it. And we never learn. My side, maybe you feel that way about yours, I don't know. But McConnell has that focus. I think on my side, certainly Nancy Pelosi does. She always begins with the conclusion. How do we win?
Yeah.
Not, is Joe Biden a great guy who I love and owe loyalty to? It's, does this help us win? And if the answer is yes, we do it. If the answer is no, we don't.
It speaks to the question of what is the purpose of politics and what is the purpose of a political party. And I do think there are people in the business and in the game who have decided that the purpose of a party or some sort of political opportunity is not necessarily just to win, but to, make some statement about culture or, something that's going on. And I'm old-fashioned like you. I think the only thing these parties exist for is to affect winning political campaigns. That's why they exist, so you can win and then you can govern. But I think increasingly a lot of people get into politics thinking that that's a secondary issue. As long as we can influence the debate or control who is in or who is out, who gets to sit at the cool kids at the lunch table and who doesn't, as long as we can control that, we don't really care as much about whether we're winning or losing.
Right. And that's your goal, start a podcast.
Yeah.
Okay, but don't join a political party.
It's just not the purpose of a political party. It only has one purpose.
Right.
Win.
So you're a political operative, and your man wins the White House, and you're brought in to be, at a pretty young age, a senior political advisor to the President of the United States of America. And by the way, he comes in a razor-thin margin, losing the popular vote and a very controversial Supreme Court opinion. So you got a deeply divided country then. I know we are now. We'll get to today in a minute. But that's a very different role, right, than being this hardcore partisan, I exist to win. Now, all of a sudden, you're working for Americans who didn't vote for you.
Absolutely. And the name of the game for Bush, I felt like for all 8 years, was coalition building. And it was making policy to try to build as many bridges as you could. And look at some of the things he did and some of the partners that he acquired, Democratic partners along the way, whether it was on education reform or on prescription drug, Medicare Part D. I mean, these things didn't always thrill the most conservative parts of his base, but he thought it was good for the country, and he also thought it was good for coalition building. So trying to add to your coalition, not take away from it. And to me, that's another great lesson that I have learned over the years is surround yourself in this business with people who want to add to the basket, not take people out of the basket. It's hard to win when you're constantly taking people out of the basket. And that's something actually, interestingly, that I think Trump actually learned in this campaign.
Really?
Yes.
Because he seems to me to be really about division and subtraction, not about addition and multiplication.
Well, I think that he lost the popular vote twice, and then he managed to win it. And
kind of.
And it's unusual for politicians to go that direction.
Yeah.
And so when you are an improving commodity, it tells me you learned a thing or two about adding people. And it's obvious who they added. Working class people.
Especially Latino men, you mentioned.
Latino men. But large swaths of working class Americans who had spent their whole lives either out of politics or voting Democrat, all of a sudden said, I'm going to give it a go. And unlike other Republican candidacies, he somehow figured out how to put more people in the basket. Now, a lot of folks were arguing that he was removing as many former Republicans as he was adding. And that was always the algebra question of this election. But it's obvious that he was right and they were wrong.
Well, when President Bush comes in office, one of the first things he did, this really caught my attention. Because I'd known him in Texas as governor, and I was pretty upset about the election of the Supreme Court. But one of the first things he did was name the Justice Department building after Robert F. Kennedy. Those of you who are young, there used to be a guy named Robert F. Kennedy who was an extraordinary, wonderful man and a great leader, and tragically cut down. And the reason that mattered was Clinton had cut a deal with Gingrich. The Clinton White House had. Clinton wasn't personally involved. The deal was, it was in some bill to name the airport in D.C., which was already named after George Washington, who was a pretty good president in my eyes, to name it after Ronald Reagan. So now it's Washington Reagan. Okay, fine. In exchange for which, the Republicans, Newt agreed to name the Justice Department building after Bobby Kennedy. This will shock you, but Newt welched on the deal. He just lied. He sent Clinton a bill with only Reagan's name on it. And because I'm a horrible person, I was like, well, veto it. Teach him a lesson. And Clinton's like, I am not going to veto a bill honoring Ronald Reagan. That's the question, not did Newt welch on the deal. And so, of course, he signed the bill. Airport gets named after Reagan. Bush was not a party to that deal at all. He had nothing to do with it. He didn't welch on anything. He never gave his word. He just came in and did it on his own. I think because he's a good guy, but also because he wanted to build bridges. And Teddy Kennedy was central to helping pass his education bill.
Absolutely.
So that taught me a lot about Bush's character and about this need to broaden and build.
Absolutely. And for Trump, coming out of this election, having somehow figured out how to do this coalition building this time around, the question will be, does it extend to policymaking? And now,
Does it? Or will it?
I tend to think that they are going to try to enforce some of the promises they made to build this coalition. Now, whether the Congress, now fully run by Republicans, is going to go along with all of it, I don't know. But I think, and he made some promises during the election that are not traditional conservative, orthodox kind of promises. But if you were in his shoes, the political argument to your party is, I just won the national popular vote on this, and a bunch of you came in with me. Why don't you follow me along for another couple of years and see what happens? So in this case, can the coalition building extend to governing? Bush, I think, did this great. And it's why he got reelected, I think, in 2004, among other things. And the better presidents know how to put more people in the basket, not just in the middle of a campaign, but also while they hold the office.
So one of the things, and I love, I've been at CNN forever and a day, but one of the things I don't love is that they always ask us to predict rather than to analyze. The other thing they do is they ask about motive. Why do you think he did this? Well, there's always one motive: to get votes. Okay, why does the coach start Caleb Williams for the Chicago Bears? Because to score points.
To win.
Right, to win. So I think I'm sorry, but that's kind of dumb. And I'm not going to be dumb with you. So rather than predict what will happen or what's motivating Trump wants to be popular. He's a politician. That's pretty obvious. He wants more popularity, votes, and power. What advice would you give him if he was here right now and he's like, okay, I've got this thing. I did get more votes than the other person, which he did not the last time. And what do I do with it? I got the House, I got the Senate, I got the White House. What should he be doing?
I think he's got 2 years, obviously, before the midterms, and then immediately the next presidential campaign will start. And my presumption is his own vice president is going to be the front runner and probable nominee of the Republican Party in 2028. And so if I were in his shoes, I would be thinking about legacy. And the legacy for any president is, can you either get reelected or can you pass it on to the next? And the way to do that for J.D. Vance is for him to have a successful policy presidency. And it's amazing. He has an incredible 2-year chance to do that.
Right.
All he has to do is do something on the economy that people will then, the economy gets better, you get credit for it, and he has to do something on immigration. Those are the two motivating issues.
Right.
And at the same time, if you feel like you've been a bulwark against the cultural excesses of the left, or however you would call it, that is going to have been deemed a success. And so if I were him, that's all I would be thinking about right now is...
So that would be what would be the focus, the McConnell-like focus. And I know McConnell and Trump are very close.
They're not golfing buddies. Probably aren't going to be. But that's it. I think it's easy to overcomplicate this.
Right.
When you're the president, what do? You have a legislative agenda, and you defend the country, and you run the government, and you deal with the crisis. I mean, most of what you're doing is you're dealing with things you couldn't have predicted that would happen.
Right.
But from a proactive perspective, you're just, you're going to come up with a few pieces of legislation that are your signature things that you hope are responsive to the things on which you got elected. And for Trump, it's real simple. Is the cost of living going to be under control in the eyes of the voters, and is the border going to be under control? For me, that's it. That's every day. Everybody that works in the White House should be thinking about those two things, and if they do, he's going to be okay.
That's pretty good advice. I can't resist. I know it's hard. What would you tell the Democrats? If I get access to like one of the smartest political minds I know, I'm not going to like let this go and not get free advice from my party.
Yeah, I think look, it's hard to have a political party that is completely and totally disconnected with 80% of the counties in America. I mean, look at the map. Look at the county map of America. Now, I know a lot of counties don't have a ton of people.
Yeah, come on. I mean, I grew up in one of those. But my party has won the popular vote in 7 out of the last 9. It's never happened in American history. So I just don't, I'm sorry, I don't buy the notion that they're somehow fundamentally disconnected from America. We're basically a 50-50 country.
you're disconnected to non-urban America is my point. And it just look at the map. You have significant problems talking to people who live far away from universities. And so my advice would be analyze, why is that? Why is it that people in West Kentucky who would have laid on the train tracks for Bill Clinton are now out here, buying Trump signs by the bushel?
Right.
Why? Why do you think that is? And so that my principal advice would be, why is that? My guess is it's because the politicians who've been installed at the top of the party have just shown little to no interest, and in fact, maybe some condescension to these people, and it's going to have to change. And so my advice would be, do you want to be a political party that can have a conversation anywhere in the country? That is one of the things, love it or not, love it or hate him, Trump somehow figured out how to improve himself in virtually every corner of the American electorate and every corner of the country. He did better than any Republican's done in New York City since 1988. He did better among Jewish voters. He did better among Arab voters. He did better among African Americans. He did really well comparatively with Hispanics. Across the board, he found himself in a pool of improvement. And so he's not confined, his viewpoints, the Republican viewpoint was not confined to just certain little pockets. My advice would be, are we confined? And if so, why? Who is confining us? What are the issues that are confining us? And do we need to let some of it go?
Well, from my perspective, again, growing up in a small town, which was very, very right-wing. And I lived most of my life now in Shenandoah County, one of the few counties where Trump did a little less, not much, but he got 71 last time, 70 this time. So everybody I live with is a Trumper, okay?
What happened to you?
But yeah, I learned how to read, and that was a terrible thing. No, I actually still believe Democrats are the party of the strivers and the working class, and that's why I'm a Democrat. And for the first time, the Financial Times published this, and I sent it to all my kids who are all in politics now, they're young. They looked over 80 years, and they took 3 or 4 attributes that define the parties. And the Democratic Party consistently, all the way back to 80 years ago, was seen as the party of the working class. And for the first time this year, it is more identified with social and cultural elitism than it is with working class economics. And that's what you're talking about. That is for me as a Democrat, that is a heartbreak. That's Western Kentucky, okay? That's 2,500 of the 3,100 counties in America. They have come to believe that my party is a party of the faculty lounge, not the factory floor.
Yeah.
And that's a huge challenge for my folks. But I do think, honestly, there's a challenge for Mr. Trump, is that he is below 50% of the popular vote and will be, I think, he'll settle there because the rest of the votes are in California. So he'll still never have had a single day of his 9-year and 5-month term running for president. 9 years and 5 months, 3,432 days. Never had one day over 50%. So I guess my counsel, you didn't ask, my counsel to him would be engage with a little George W. Bush-esque coalition building and humility, which I think probably comes very naturally to Mr. Trump.
I think there are Democrats who actually get this, understand it, and probably embody it already. I mean, I have said on television before, I consider myself on most days a John Fetterman Republican.
Right.
Because I think he actually gets exactly what you just said.
Right.
And he is unyielding on the things that he cares about. He doesn't, I think there is just a craving, truthfully, for authenticity. Mm-hmm. And
that's a good point.
And it's why Trump is able to do what he's able to do. He doesn't feel like a scripted politician. He doesn't feel like someone is handing him a literal script to read, and his hand things are not memorized, his facial expressions are not memorized. He has an authenticity about him. So does Fetterman. The people who are most successful in this business right now have a genuine authenticity about them that people respond to. And it doesn't mean you agree with everything they say. I don't agree with everything John Fetterman believes, but I'll tell you this, I believe he authentically is representing his viewpoints, and I admire deeply that he is willing to take positions that the most partisan people in his party are raging against on a daily basis, particularly on the war in the Middle East. And so, to me, there are obvious people out there who sort of already understand this, and I don't think you have to reinvent the wheel to understand who in the Democratic Party has things to teach other Democrats. It's just, and I think if we've learned anything lately, it's just the people are. I mean, Biden had a little of this. He was not very good at being scripted either.
Right.
But there's something authentic about even being a gaffe machine.
Right.
People just, it's somewhat endearing because there's not an assumption that you are just a robot and there are unnamed people behind you plugging in the wires.
Well,
I think it's a real lesson.
The last couple minutes we have, we work in legacy media, right? And I love it. But we are now we're in a post-television age. Social media.
Speak for yourself.
Drives, well, yeah.
I got a lot of work to do.
No, I love CNN. They've been great to me. But huge percentages of Americans and the majority of young people get their news from social media. And that's a completely different, and I actually think your point about authenticity is even more important.
Yes.
On social media. But how have you seen social media changing?
I get to speak to my personal experience this year. I went to the Knicks game in New York the other night before a show. I saw 3 quarters. Well, I saw a quarter and a half. I could not get off the concourse.
Wow.
Because people were walking up to me saying, I see your clips. I see your clips. They didn't say they were watching CNN necessarily. I see your clips every day. And so the consumption of what we do, even now, I think it's even more voluminous off of linear TV than it is on. I mean, the other day we did something on the 10 o'clock show, and I woke up the next morning, Elon Musk had tweeted it out. I mean, it had like 15 million views. I mean, 15 million people weren't watching the show. And so one of the things I've learned is
Elon Musk being that non-American born engineer or something. No, we've heard of him. Right?
Look,
no, my point is he's got the largest platform on earth, and he decides to put jet fuel behind you. That's going to get you a lot of.
And before everybody hates on him, we're depending on him to rescue our astronauts in like February. So let's be nice to him until he brings them home. But yes, so what I learned this year, and this is the first time I've been with the network for 7.5 years, and it's the first time that I ever really felt the power of the rapid nature of social media distribution. I mean, usually we would go on TV, we'll do something, maybe people talk about it for a few hours and then it's over. It's like, it's just gone. Now, you get this amazing boost out of it. And so I actually think there's a place for what we do, but we're content creators now. But I think we have to realize that the content we're creating, more people are going to see it off of TV than they saw it on TV, and how we react to that.
And does that change when you're on the set? And you do some of the panel shows that I don't do because I've already done Crossfire. Okay, sorry, but I have. But you're in the moment. Are you thinking like that, or are you just?
I'm not trying.
Scott.
I'm not trying to create moments, but I can tell when things are happening on the set that I immediately have an instinct for, this is going to get clipped. Either if I did it or somebody else did it, I can I'm getting pretty good at predicting. I know we're out of time, and I just wanted to say one thing about you. I got hired by CNN 7.5 years ago. All I ever wanted to do was be a pundit on CNN. I've been a political operative. I was a radio disc jockey when I was a teenager, and I have been in this business and all I ever wanted to do was be Paul Begala. So when they hired me, they're like, "Well, come up to New York and we'll try you out for a week." And the very first thing they said, "Well, you're going to go out here and be on with Paul Begala tonight." And I thought, my God, this guy's going to destroy me in 6 minutes, and I'll never get another chance. And I could not have had a better experience, a more gracious debating partner. And I've told you this privately, but I'll tell you publicly.
Thank you.
Everything I do, I have almost fully modeled after Paul Begala and the way he does his punditry. It's smart, it's funny, he never takes it too personally, he doesn't die on every hill. And there's a collegiality and a camaraderie in what he does that I think comes through the screen. And I think the best pundits play it that way. And so the lessons I've taken from
Scott,
you have served me extremely well.
Thank you.
Even though our medium, according to you, is dying, I still think
You've breathed new life into it. So I want everybody to join me. Politics is a good thing. Scott Jennings is a very good guy. So thank you, Scott, very much. Thanks. That was terrific.
right, I'm excited and pleased and happy and all those good things to introduce our final panel before the reception, to which I hope Dave is here. I think everybody's invited to it, and if you weren't before, you are now. And it's somewhere close to here. Dave will have to tell us exactly where. Anyway, I'm so pleased to be able to introduce our final panel, and our moderator for this panel is a very experienced moderator. She's got a lot of background in this, and you see her every Sunday morning, and I'll get to that in just a second. Now, she is on the board for the Center for Politics. That's the most important thing about her. The other things are footnotes, really, compared to that one thing. And second on the list would be she's an alum of the University of Virginia. And really, what else is there?
Exactly.
Those two things would suffice. But she's also, as you know, moderator of Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan. And she is frequently, I see her on the evening news as well. She's chief foreign affairs correspondent and a contributing correspondent to 60 Minutes. Margaret became moderator of Face the Nation in February 2018 and quickly became known for her tough but fair, I love this, instead of fair and balanced, tough but fair, this I prefer, questioning of world leaders, politicians, and policymakers. And this is personal, but I love the fact that you include so much international relations and U.S. foreign affairs in your program, because often it's a footnote or it's not even included in the programs. There's more than domestic politics. I can't believe I'm saying this, but there is more than domestic politics. Thank you for doing that in your show. Also, you know, most of the aides in her show are from the University of Virginia. It's like a conspiracy. It really is, but it's a good kind of conspiracy. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. wouldn't approve. Yeah, I'm sorry. If you were
Also
obviously
from the University of Virginia.
Pardon me?
Also from the
University of Virginia Law School. I had nothing to do with it. His father was a UVA grad. Teddy was a UVA grad. And President and Mrs. Kennedy used to come down to UVA with some frequency. So we had a lot of Kennedy connections. It only makes sense that one of them's a black sheep. There must be a Kennedy-gate up here. I was very upset at the mention of RFK Jr. Now, let me get back to Margaret, because I'm introducing her. She joined CBS News in 2012 and has had roles including State Department and White House correspondent. While contributing across all CBS News broadcasts and platforms, Margaret has broken stories, including the news that members of the Trump cabinet were discussing invoking the 25th Amendment following the January 6th siege of the U.S. Capitol. Well, at least they know how to do it. It will come in handy, perhaps. Boy, what a dead group. For you UVA students, lowest grade curve ever. Just warning you, they took that seriously. In addition to the Center for Politics Board, Margaret is also board member of the Council on Foreign Relations. I think I mentioned she graduated with the highest distinction from the University of Virginia in 2002, where she earned a bachelor's degree in foreign affairs and Middle East studies with a minor in Arabic. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our distinguished moderator, Margaret Brennan.
Thank you, Larry. And thanks to all of you for being here in person and for those of you who are streaming online. And hopefully this isn't like a requirement for college credit. Look, it is? Okay. All right. Extra credit. Okay. We won't make it too painful then. We'll make it fun. But it's good to see you all here, and it's great to have such a wonderful panel. I'll briefly introduce some of them, although they probably are very familiar to you. And Larry, again, thank you for asking me to be part of this and to be part of the Center for Politics. So we want to look forward to what in God's name is happening next. It's a big question around the country, is what to expect. We have here with us Kyle Kondik, managing editor of Sabatos Crystal Ball, the University of Virginia Center for Politics' authoritative, nonpartisan newsletter on American campaigns and elections. And Kyle was actually pulling an all-nighter with all of us at CBS News on election night, my first all-nighter since the University of Virginia days, when we stayed up live on air until 6 o'clock in the morning. You kept working to crunch those numbers to figure out all the exit polls.
I went back to 5:30 and slept for 2 hours and came back, so
Well, it's more than I got.
That's probably
they
what-
made me
yeah,
get back
right.
on air at 7:40.
Right,
Lucky you. Chris Krebs also with us on CBS on election night. He's the Chief Intelligence and Public Policy Officer at Sentinel-1, co-chair of the Aspen Institute's U.S. Cybersecurity Working Group, and on the board at the University of Virginia Center for Politics and CBS News contributor. As you well know, he was the first director of Homeland Security's CISA agency. He ran U.S. cyber policy for Microsoft prior to that. Next to Chris is Tara Setmeyer. She is the co-founder and CEO of the Seneca Project, a bipartisan women-led super PAC, political action committee, dedicated to galvanizing moderate women voters to safeguard women's rights and protect democracy. She's serving as the University of Virginia Center for Politics Scholar for the 2024 to 25 year, and prior to UVA, was named as a Harvard Institute of Politics Spring 2020 resident fellow. So clearly she traded up.
And I'm also a GW alum.
Oh,
This is my alma mater, so it's a full circle moment, and this building did not exist when I went here many decades ago.
Well, I'm sure it's good to be back on
It
campus.
is.
And rounding us out here, we have Alex Theodoridis. Did I say it right?
Excellent.
Associate professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Before joining the faculty there, he was an assistant professor at the University of California, Merced, and spent a year in residence at Vanderbilt University as a senior visiting scholar at the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. He also helped launch the University of Virginia Center for Politics. So welcome to all. I want to look forward, not just backwards here. Kyle, we had a very, very, very long election night. And going into that night, the thought was, this is going to be a week and a half or so to find out the results. As you were analyzing the data as it came in, what did you walk away with as the message voters sent about what America wants?
I think it was just like another change election, that they were just upset with the party in power and acted accordingly. Although, given that Donald Trump, actually won the popular vote by, it looks like probably about 1.5 points, Republicans flipped the Senate, which was expected. I thought their performance in the House was actually fairly underwhelming. And that is actually one thing we are still waiting on, is the precise number of what the House breakdown is going to be. There are particularly a couple of races out in California that will determine whether the Republicans end up with as few as 220 members elected in this election. 218 is the majority. So for the third straight House election, we're going to have an extremely narrow majority. And then, Matt Gaetz may or may not be part of the next House. He resigned from this one. There's actually an interesting legal discussion about what might happen with him. But the House is very narrow, and it's only going to get more narrow based on some of these appointments. For me on election night, when we were there at CBS watching the returns, the thing that really screamed out that was like a big problem for Kamala Harris was when Loudoun County came in, and that's a place that has really swung very heavily to Democrats recently. And instead of winning it by 25 points like Joe Biden did, Harris only won it by 16, which is what Hillary Clinton had won it by, and so that contributed to certainly weaker than Joe Biden did in Virginia, and it was a signal on election night of sort of what was to come.
Mm-hmm. Were you surprised?
I had never felt like I had a good handle on the presidential election, to be honest. Really? But there were some maybe signals that Virginia might be closer. So I figured it would be closer than it was in 2020. But the thing that was surprising to me in Loudoun as part of it is that I really thought Harris would do better than Biden in some of these big, affluent, highly educated suburban counties that have been moving toward the Democrats. But, she did worse in Loudoun and Northern Virginia in general. Mm-hmm. She did worse in the Philly collar counties than Biden did. She did slightly better in the heavily Republican suburbs around Milwaukee, but not by enough to actually flip Wisconsin. And so she suffered all of this, leakage and really, big losses among certain demographic groups. But the places that had been trending really strongly Democratic, she stalled out in those places too. And that's how you get a situation where Trump not only wins, which was not that surprising, but that he also wins the popular vote because of, she's just not really improving anywhere significantly.
Chris, in going into election night, you and I spoke frequently leading up to it about the information environment we're in and attempts to mislead people, manipulate voters, hack their minds. Post-election, I've thought a lot about the information environment we live in because folks have said to me, it was such a mandate for the Republicans and for Donald Trump that it shows nothing prior mattered. Do you believe that that is it? Or are we in an information environment where people just don't hear the things that in different time periods would resonate with voters?
Oof, that's heavy. I do think that we are in a dramatically different information environment than we were in, I would even say, the spring, summer of 2020. Trust in media is lower.
Yep.
The majority of information, particularly in the lower demographic or the younger demographic cohorts, are online. It's TikTok, it's X, it's Reddit. So the way we get information is different. They're not always through what we would historically consider, trusted voices. And that gave rise, I think, to both exploitation by true bad guys, Russians. We saw a significant increase in what we used to know as the Internet Research Agency. That's the group famous for 2016, run by Prigozhin out of Russia, St. Petersburg. The coaching tree of that organization flooded the zone with garbage, claiming to be the FBI, sending out videos saying, hey, it's unsafe due to physical violence at the polls, so you need to vote online. That was not the FBI doing it. The FBI got out very quickly to debunk that. But it was such an overwhelming tidal wave of information. And that was just the foreign piece. We also saw a shift in how the adversary, the Russians again, were coming in and kind of laundering money into supporting and paying for influencers. In this case, they were right-wing conservative influencers. What we found, or at least what was publicly reported, was that it was a handful. But according to the DOJ indictments, the Russians were tracking several thousand potential influencers, not just here in the US. We also saw that others were paying individual influencers on X specifically $100 to post and promote, amplify content. So the bad guys are figuring out how to exploit the new way we consume information. And unfortunately, we have influencers / grifters here that are all too happy to ride that money train and put it out there regardless of the outcome. So I think we have a problem going forward on information. I think that it's also now just kind of baked into the political system. And we have to dramatically rethink, or at least advance our thinking about how we're engaging across the political spectrum. And there was a comment earlier about Democrats need to build their own infrastructure for media. No, I don't think that's right at all. I think you need to go and meet the voters where they are.
Right.
And get your message out that way.
Yeah.
That's the difference here.
You mean that Democrats need their own Joe Rogan?
Right. Joe Rogan is neither here nor there.
No, exactly. No, I would agree with you on that. Joe Rogan's Oprah for men. It's just like interesting entertainment and conversation. It's not journalism.
I want to know who's listening, though, to 4-hour podcasts. It's absolutely insane to me that...
You don't have that time?
No, I hit 45 minutes and I clock out.
Tara, you know campaigns and this world well. I would say, to build on Chris's point, in terms of the information environment, one thing that journalists like myself face is there seems less incentive for a campaign to engage with serious, credible journalists who are going to ask them well-informed research and sometimes hard questions. And both campaigns from both parties know that, and they do the shoot it right into my vein, Joe Rogan kind of talk to me for 4 hours without fact-checking, and love it. The straight-to-consumer information campaigning, is that the future?
It seems to be. It's the modern-day version of retail politics. And the overwhelming amount of ways that the right-wing ecosystem has disseminated information and disinformation and misinformation is it's just overwhelming. It's when I was a journalism minor here, my Professor Puffenbarger, who was a longtime veteran journalist at the Washington Post, would be spinning in his grave right now if he saw the way that the political media and the way that political folks consume information and how it's being disseminated now, and how these podcasts and websites that don't have fact checking, that don't have due diligence, that are out here influencing so many people. It's like against everything that we're taught, right? But to Chris's point, you have to meet people where they are too. And unfortunately, the right has been better at that and exploiting that void. And one of the things that Donald Trump did early on, which is consistent with what authoritarians want to do, is discredit the media, the enemy of the people. He didn't come up with that. We've heard that before. And the more that you don't have those trusted voices as much anymore. This is not like it was 30, 40 years ago, where you had the three major anchors and you had the New York Times and the Washington Post, and there were trusted sources that people knew when they turned it on that, okay, I can get my information from here. That has been blown up in ways that are, I mean, it's important to ask questions and things like that, but this is something completely different. And it's scary because if we cannot agree on the basic set of facts, how do we move forward? How do we speak to people when there's a large group of people that believe that the sun now rises in the west and sets in the east? And then when we try to say, but no, that's not true. It's actually the other way, that we're demonized now as somehow being elitists because we believe in science and facts and things that have been true this whole time. Now, all of a sudden they're not, because Steve Bannon in his 4-hour podcast every day is telling you otherwise, and then demonizing the people who were the scientists who proved years ago that actually the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. Oh, no, now it doesn't. I don't know how you compete with that other than trying to create an information environment, at least for the people who are not susceptible to that propaganda, so that they're well informed. Mm-hmm. And then when you have that, then it's a matter of accountability and reminding people what's at stake if this other information that is untruthful or being demagogued, you see what the consequences of that are. I don't know quite how we combat the other side without starting to at least build an infrastructure that combats it, because we can't just roll over and accept that the Steve Bannons of the world are now the major news sources for people, because then you end up with the environment that we're in now, where people just don't believe in facts and truth and expertise.
I believe in facts and truth and expertise, and try to defend the hour I have every Sunday. And I know my colleagues continue to do so to the extent that they can. But Alex, I mean, this isn't just who's winning market share question. For policymakers, this complicates trying to write laws. This complicates getting things passed when you're trying to redefine and manipulate truth all the time. Have you thought much about that, and how we as a country, we're already fractured, if you can't agree, as we were just hearing laid out there by Tara, on a common set of facts? How do you move forward?
Yeah, I think it's a big challenge, and I think one group that we don't often look at, there are lots of information sources in the news media, but a big information source for voters is other political elites, candidates. And what we've seen is elite failure on the Republican side in particular, in this case, of normalizing all sorts of stuff about Donald Trump. If I hear another Republican politician say, well, I'm not normalizing it, a huge proportion of voters believe there were problems with the 2020 election, and a huge proportion of voters think January 6th was not that awful a thing, and they voted for Trump now. Well, the reason voters believe those things is they follow the leaders. They learn from their leaders, and so we have this problem. I don't necessarily have a solution to it, because obviously it's been vindicated now in a sense. The other thing I will say, sort of as a political scientist, it often comes to us to say sort of boring stuff. And the boring thing here is that mandates are a chimera. They don't really exist usually. It's a very rare thing. In this election in particular, if you're looking to sort of vivisect it either from the right or from the left, this was part of a global trend of anti-incumbent elections post-pandemic, during pandemic and post-pandemic, obviously dealing with a very difficult time. Incumbent governments have taken a beating, and so from the perspective of Democrats, this extensive sort of recrimination, I think, likely sort of goes too far and is a little too knee-jerk. That's probably also true of the way the media sort of interpret, successes and failures. But it's certainly true from the perspective of the Trump administration coming in. It won't matter. I don't think there's a mandate for all of the stuff that Trump said any more than there's sort of vindication of him as a Arnold Palmer hagiographer. But it will be interpreted that way, and they will overreach. And so the expectation in normal situations, if you're a Republican, you should be hoping they don't overreach. Because otherwise, 2026, by all historical and modeling expectations, should be a bloodbath in favor of Democrats.
Meaning they gain a narrow majority in the closely divided House?
Everything's very close, but presumably the smart money right now would be on Democrats taking the House. Probably not. Certainly not by the kind of majorities that they enjoyed in the 70s and 80s.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, elections, Kyle, you can weigh in on this. Elections, if the most recent patterns continue to replicate, are just going to be close, particularly in some of these midterms, possibly. So is there that check and balance there in the same way that there used to be? I mean, we're going to see a stress test of this come January in the Senate, certainly.
Right. I will say, just a little aside here about, when Matt Gaetz was nominated to be Attorney General, of course, that's the news of the day that he's not going to be AG, which others have talked about. But there was this sort of idea that Trump was sort of testing the new Senate majority, basically like, hey, these guys are going to do anything I want. And it turns out that actually wasn't true. And we'll see if any of these other nominees don't make it. Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense nominee, he's got some problems as well. So that's an interesting question. In terms of the midterm, the midterm is often the engine of change in the House and the Senate. The House majority has not changed hands now since 1952 in a presidential year, but you see it change over many times in midterms: 2022, 2018, 2010, 2006, 1994. And again, you would, as Alex said, you would generally expect that the Democrats should be able to win the House back in 2026. One little wrinkle, though, is that, one of the things that can happen in the midterm is that sort of the party that wins the presidency in the House in the presidential year, they kind of overextend themselves, and then that sort of fades away in the midterm. What's interesting about the actual results, and we're still digging through this, is that there really are only going to be probably a relative handful. It might be able to just count on one hand how many Republican House members are going to be elected from districts that Kamala Harris carried for president. And there's probably going to be at least a dozen Democrats in districts that Trump carried. Back in 2016, when Trump won and Republicans won, it was 241 seats in the House, so it was a much bigger majority. But there were 25 Republicans in districts that Hillary Clinton won, and Democrats won all but 3 of those districts in the 2018 midterm. This time, there's not the Republicans. They have fewer seats, but they're not as overextended, and so that'll be something to watch here for the 2026 midterm in the House. The Senate is a heavier lift for the Democrats because Republicans, assuming Dave McCormick wins in Pennsylvania, which looks like he's very likely to, it's going to be 53-47 Republican. And if you look at the Senate map for 2026, there aren't that many great targets for the Democrats to try to win the Senate majority back in 2026.
Chris, in terms of the information environment, this is a different reaction to an election than when Trump was first elected in 2016 and you saw protests. You're not seeing that same reaction. Obviously, the fact that he won the popular vote is different. The mandate that he has perceived through the party wins also are different. But there is just a different feeling and reaction to this. Are you concerned that people will tune out in terms of even paying attention to what's happening? I mean,
well, look, there are still efforts to undermine the credibility or the legitimacy of this election. I mean, I get emails and in-mails and DMs every single day.
Saying what?
Saying, oh, you need to go look at these numbers. Bullet ballots, for instance, that something's not right. 20 million. First off, that was the day of, and that has now gotten a lot tighter, the distance in the popular vote between Trump and Harris. It's gotten much, much, much closer. So what we are seeing is that those supporters of Harris and Democrats are saying, hey, no, this election was in fact, and whether it's Starlink and Musk and all that changing votes, it's all nonsense. Like, that's not how any of this works. 97 to 98% of votes cast in this election have had a paper ballot associated with it.
Mm-hmm.
And we're seeing post-election audits taking place right now to validate the outcome of this election. If anything, the fact that this one went smoothly in the midst of no meaningful changes in the infrastructure, in the laws and the regulations, in the administration of the election from 2020, only validates that 2020 was in fact a secure, safe, fair election.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I'll wait for my thank you note from the team later. But no, look, you know, it is a very resilient system in terms of the election administration. What is not resilient and is what is changing on a daily basis, particularly when you see, again, the information environment in some of the places where people go. Blue Sky, for instance, now is the kind of the refuge out of
what is
X.
that?
It's another social media platform that is, as of the last 2 days, has eclipsed, I believe, Threads. In at least in daily average users, so over 20 million in terms of users. But that's people are leaving X because of whether it's the political tenor there, whether it's the kind of linkages with Elon Musk and the administration. Nonetheless,
it's a kindler, gentler Twitter for now, anyway.
But the bigger point here is that the information ecosystem is not as resilient and is much more exploitable and susceptible to interference and frankly grifting. So that's what I think we really are going to have to deal with and struggle with. And I think politically, again, that is what any subsequent political party, Republican or Democrat, is going to have to figure out. And I've always believed that it's easier to win when you're voting for someone rather than voting against someone.
Mm-hmm.
And you got to be able to get your message out there. And you've got to figure out where the people that are susceptible to that engagement are going to be most susceptible.
Do you think that the adversaries and their intention to mislead were successful? I mean, even on election night, you were seeing posts about Philadelphia and questions about voting there from the president-elect, then the candidate.
I'm a believer that from a tactical perspective, meaning an individual post or an individual video or an individual article in and of itself doesn't have much of an impact, if any. So if that one video that comes out that says from the FBI, allegedly from the FBI, that says, hey, you need to vote online, that doesn't really move the needle at all. But it's the aggregate. It's the 100 plus, 200, 300 that are constantly just that constant barrage of nonsense. And so it moves people to a position, a very unfortunate position, where they don't believe anything anymore.
Right.
In part because we are always out there talking about it. It's like, nope, this is the Russians, this is the Russians. I don't even know who to believe anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So we've kind of lost that North Star. And in some cases, that's the point. For some actors out there. And that's the strategic impact. So not the tactical impact of individual videos, it's the strategic impact of what the Russians are doing, and now increasingly what domestic influencers, domestic actors are doing, having seen the playbook have some effect. at least in prior cycles. And that's the thing that worries me the most, is that looking forward, everything is a copycat. So playbooks that were run in 2016 by the Russians were copied by the Iranians in 2020. Things that were run in 2020 by domestics were further expanded by domestic actors in 24. And so things like bomb threats called in very targeted jurisdictions in swing states at scale, that will only be more of a problem going forward. And there really are not good interventions to stop bomb threats as a service, which is effectively what we're talking about right here.
So, Alex, one of the things that we saw in our polling that I suppose is hopeful is that among young voters, it wasn't that they were giving up or so disaffected that they were apathetic and therefore unplugging, not paying attention anymore, but that there was a distrust that the democratic process, that the voting process was the best way to affect change in this country.
Mm-hmm.
That's scary.
It's terrifying, and it's not just young voters on that. I'll tell you what is young voters specifically, though, is that all of what we look at, people our age look at as sort of an aberration politically, is just politics. As far as they're concerned. Trump started running in 2015. So people who are in my classes, that's probably their earliest political memory. Certainly you go any younger than that. And I think that it is scary. People don't see, especially when they don't view things as going great, they don't see voting and engagement in politics as a way to affect change, as you said. And to the point Chris just made, it highlights, again, the importance of leaders, because as you say, we're hearing lots of stuff from cranks on the left right now about this election. People are naturally, in a polarized kind of context, people are naturally inclined to be incredulous when their side loses. They're naturally inclined to believe conspiracy theories that suggest malfeasance or inappropriate behavior or terrible motives from people on the other side.
Is that coming up in your classes? Are young people raising those things to you?
Oh, I mean, I'm at UMass Amherst, so, but yes, absolutely. I mean, I see it on Facebook. I see it from students, the kinds of things concern. I think my students know that I'm like anti-conspiracy theorist, and as Chris pointed out, just my answer to those things is usually that is not how things work. But the problem is when elite. So you're hearing some of that stuff, but it's very marginal. And the reason it's marginal is because Kamala Harris isn't saying those things, right? Tim Walz is not saying those things. Every Democratic member of Congress isn't repeating those things and then eventually falling back on, well, I'm hearing this, people are concerned about it, right? And so that kind of effect is extremely potent when it comes to these things, and it particularly comes out of this moment of polarization, which is unique in the sense that it's partisan polarization. And partisan polarization, unlike polarization that wasn't along party lines about the Vietnam War or whatever, makes the institutions of democracy a target. Potentially. It puts them in the crossfire. And that's a real problem when leaders on one side or the other decide, you know what, I'm gonna take advantage of this and take advantage of the fact that people come to me for opinions.
That's what's happening right now. I mean, I don't think when we were talking about what voters voted for, I don't know that did they really vote for dismantling our democracy and our institutions? I don't think so. They told us they voted because of affordability, because of the price of eggs, because they wanted change. But there is more that went along with choosing the change agent in the Trump MAGA vision for America. It seemed that people rationalized a lot of the other stuff because they felt that, well, something's got to change. And Chris, I actually had a question for you about the global, to Alex's point about how globally there's been this backlash against incumbency since COVID. Is part of that the international propaganda, disinformation, not just here, but the Russians and other actors seeing that this is a pain point? Or is it unique to us that they're doing this?
Oh, it's not unique to
Yeah, I
us.
didn't think so.
But it is important to note that it's not because of the Russians or the Chinese.
Right.
They are exploiting
Correct.
existing seams.
Yeah.
And this is where, 20 years from now, we will look back at COVID as transforming society on many, many different levels.
Yeah.
From a health perspective, from a trust in government perspective, from a supply chain and economic disruption perspective, from an information consumption perspective. I mean, just massively transformative in so many different aspects. And what we are seeing right now, again, is that move away from the center trusted media sources into, I need to get it somewhere else.
Yeah, so it seems to me like that is those actors recognize those pain points culturally in our environments, particularly in Western style democracies, and by pitting us against each other, but also undermining the value of democracy. This rise in populism and nationalist populism, we're seeing this again. We saw this in the 20th century and how that worked out, but they saw an opportunity to fracture us with this, and this change and this mandate that Donald Trump that thinks he has isn't to change. We're not talking about changing marginal tax rates. We're not talking about waste, fraud, and abuse at a couple of cabinet departments. We're talking about literally dismantling them. And I think that that's on purpose. It's not about reform, it's about destroying. And I think we need to be very clear-eyed about what they think their mandate is. It's very different than I think what the majority of the American people who voted for the other side think that they were voting for. But unfortunately, until those consequences are felt, people don't change until there's enough pain being felt. And I fear for what that's going to look like post-January 20th.
Just pulling the thread a little bit more on the Russia piece, though, whether it's Putin and Russia or Xi and China, their number one audience, by the way, and their number one target of information operations, it's not us. It's their domestic audiences. They have to control the information ecosystem because one little thing that sneaks through and is able to get to their audiences can actually have huge consequences. We have such an open environment from press, free speech. They think that just getting one little bit into the conversation is dramatic. It's not. It takes a lot more than that. So they are constantly trying to control the narratives in their country, banning Western social media while they barrage ours. But their point at home is say, see, look, democracy's messed up. It doesn't work.
Right.
See all these people that, they're eating cats and dogs or whatever? Like that's the stuff that they grab those headlines and they bring it back home. But I'll note, they've already pivoted away from US elections. All that apparatus that they've developed for creating disinformation, videos, deepfakes, all that stuff, it's right back where it was probably in the early summer. It's undermining support for Ukraine. That's the target right now. That's what they're trying to hit. They've already put all their resources back there. And it's going to continue to be a focus for the next year plus, undermining support for NATO. Big. Now, there is an audience here for that. And so they will hit that. They will hit that hard.
Alex, do you think in your classrooms that next generation understands the value of what Joe Biden talked about in sort of a clunky way as the global international world order, NATO, UN, all these things that are taken for granted because they've existed for 70 plus years, but are being actively reshaped or attempted to be reshaped by China, by Russia. So in other words, does this conversation land at all when you try to have it in the classroom?
So I'm teaching campaigns and elections. I teach about American politics. We don't have that conversation very often. I would say that...
Really? Because the 2024 election, according to the Democratic Party, was about the state of democracy.
So the state of democracy...
And the
absolutely.
institutions.
Yes, and it does land with my students. I like to think that's because they're my students. But no, I mean, these are students at a state university in a blue state. and they're getting college educations. And one thing we know is that getting a college education is a big demarcation in terms of in terms of just what side you're likely to fall on. I will say that my colleagues in comparative politics all over the world and all over the country you have known for a long time that post-material things like democracy are much less motivating than material things when they face up against material things like the cost of things, et cetera. We sort of thought in this country that we were exempt from a lot of those rules that we see with voters. But it is in fact the case that democracy's greatest vulnerability is voters. It relies on them, and they're usually the pathway through which democracy is eroded because Mussolini gets the trains running on time, right? There's that kind of impulse, and so when you're talking about esoteric things like democracy and the world order and stuff like that, and people maybe they're not even experiencing anxiety economically at their own house, but they just don't think things are going great in terms of material things. That usually is gonna take the day, and I think that's what happened.
It's a luxury. It's a luxury that we have here, because if you look at like my grandfather's generation, right, the greatest generation, it's dying off, unfortunately, but the post-World War II, democracy was a big deal, right? It was on people's minds because people were alive to feel the effects of what it looked like when democracy didn't exist in an entire part of the world. We've gotten so far away from that in this country, we take it for granted. Right? It is an esoteric concept that it's kind of like, gravity or oxygen. It's just there until it's not.
Right.
And so I think that we're victims of our own success in a way, in that democracy has worked so well that people don't think about it until you lose it. And the folks like our allies in Europe are freaking out because they know what it's like to lose it and how many decades it took to get it back. And the Americans, we have no idea what that looks like, but I fear that we're about to find out. And that's where I think, to your point, Margaret, that after this election, that it just feels different than 2016. I think there's a certain amount of people being shell-shocked, number one. Number two, I think there's a certain amount of fear, because when you have someone who just won the election that's running around saying they're going to, invoke the Insurrection Act or use emergency powers to sic the military on Americans if they protest, I think that kind of stops people from deciding to protest. I just think that there's a lot of elements of this election that are very different than 2016, because we saw what happened last time when Trump decided to incite an insurrection on January 6th and didn't pay a price for it. Well, that was a practice run. Now we're about to find out what it looks like, possibly with him in power again, with less guardrails than the last time.
Well, Kyle, a good part of this country is very happy about the outcome of this election. In the polling data that you have seen, what is the affirmative view?
I mean, look,
that's a pretty dark one.
I think that one of the dynamics that we saw throughout the campaign was that, so Donald Trump's favorability was whatever the number, 44, 45, 46%. And his people's retrospective job approval of the job he did as president was almost always higher than this favorability. Sometimes it was 50, 51%. And it seems pretty clear that there is a small but important segment of the public that is sort of clear-eyed about what they don't like, or that they don't like Donald Trump. But they basically look back on his presidency and think, yeah, it wasn't as bad as it could have been. They remember pre-COVID times. They think basically they think that he did an okay job, and that they were comfortable going back to him. Or you had new people coming into the electorate who were upset about some of the material things that Alex was talking about. I think if one of the criticisms I guess you can make of the Democratic campaign is that even though things like whether January 6th was a disqualifying thing for someone like Donald Trump or commitment to democracy or whatnot, that ultimately to a lot of voters, these are kind of like first world problems. And they're sort of higher up on the hierarchy of needs, and the sort of basic stuff about inflation people were mad about, and that's what they ended up voting on. And then a great unanswered question of this next Trump presidency is like, will people be reminded of how important those things actually are, or will Trump be constrained in certain ways that he doesn't make people regret their choice, I guess?
But there was also an argument that he was campaigning on defense of democracy. If you look for 2 years of his speeches at these rallies, the references to Marxism, communism, references to, in particular, Latin American countries, perhaps those were rhetorically successful in peeling away some what we see in the polling data in terms of demographic shifts.
Yeah, look, I think he had.
There was an interesting, different characterization, and Chris knows this as well, in terms of this idea of censorship that came up on the right.
Yeah, and also this idea that for as much as we think about what is Trump going to do now with the power that he has as coming in as president, but also that he was able to sort of portray himself as a victim, and some people could look at, him being convicted in New York, these other charges against him, and say, well, hey, he's being treated unfairly. He's the victim here. And it's just like, when you ask a poll question about how concerned are you about the state of democracy, or are you worried about strongman rule or whatever, Republicans and Democrats could be concerned about that for entirely different reasons.
Well, the Philadelphia Inquirer, to that point, had a story a couple days after the election that actually made me shudder. They interviewed voters in Pennsylvania, and one voter said, yeah, do I think he's like Hitler? Yep, but I voted for the man anyway. That to me says that there is an incredible breakdown or disconnect really, between the value of rule of law in our democracy and the basic foundations of why our democratic institutions and principles are important, and people feeling upset about the economy, which our economy really wasn't that bad, but because people weren't completely informed about the way inflation works and why the prices were higher because of Donald Trump and, the mismanagement of COVID and supply chains and all of the things that happen. It's a lagging thing, but then we get lectured that, well, you can't tell anyone who can't afford baby formula or, their eggs that lagging indicators we understand that. There's a way to message that so you speak to people in plain language. I think Democrats have always struggled with that. 30 years ago, when I was vice chairman of the college Republicans here at GW, we used to argue with Democrats all the time about that because we came out of the Republican Revolution in '94, where Republicans swept into power on a very simple message of the contract with America. And we were like, we're better at this than you guys. And we were for a long time. Now, I'm no longer a Republican. I quit the party in 2020. I was never a Trump supporter, but I quit the party because of Trump and because of Republicans being hypocrites. But this whole part of being able to message in plain language simply and repetitively, Republicans do a better job of it. And unfortunately, it's manifested now in a way that is, in my opinion, quite dangerous. That people are believing things that are not necessarily true, but perception is reality in politics. I learned that right here in Politics 101. And it is true to this day. And the perception was that the economy was bad, that, that Joe Biden was not an effective president. Doesn't matter that domestically he passed all these great things and that there was infrastructure projects being built and, the CHIPS bills and, manufacturing jobs coming back. None of that mattered if the perception was it wasn't helping me in my community or people understanding why prices were higher. And I think there's lessons to be learned from the center left that how you have to explain to people why it matters and how it impacts them if you want them to listen. Otherwise, the simpler, more repetitive message that is demagogued is going to be more effective.
I think we have to remember that in the places where the campaign was run, right, where both sides, made their case, Trump underperformed relative to how he performed in the rest of the country, right? So I don't believe that his messages about democracy were really contributing a tremendous amount to his support, either among his natural supporters or among voters who could go either way.
Sorry, you mean the specific districts they decided to hold rally events in, or what do you mean?
No. I mean the swing states. the places where
He won all of them.
Yeah, where the campaign happened, yes, he won all of them, but by smaller margins. His pickup from 2020 was lower in those places than in the rest of the country, right? So where the campaign was waged, where both sides made their case, Democrats actually picked up a little bit, or the Harris campaign actually picked up a little bit
It was like California, New
from what you
York,
would
New
expect.
Jersey that he picked
Right.
up, which was
Right. But I think in terms of interpreting his messages about democracy, I just don't buy that was what motivated a lot of his voters. I just think that some of those things help people with a both sides kind of take on this. Like, okay, people are inclined to think just politicians are bad, and if you sort of present them with a little bit of that stuff, they're trying to censor you, they're trying to do this. I think you can really feed that and make it so that it's just not an issue for people.
But there was an active, for years, campaign to undermine trusted information sources.
Mm-hmm. I would argue 9 years, since 2015. It's been a hallmark of Donald Trump's entire political identity, was to go after the media and trusted sources and expertise, because then you don't have anyone to turn to. So then it's easier for them to manipulate that information and use people's grievances to further his narrative there and make him that whole victimization thing. There are a lot of people that have grievances in this country, and they saw him as their champion. And so they rationalize a lot of other things. And the idea of him taking the democracy argument and flipping it is just part of his tactics. It's the projection. I call it the Pee Wee Herman. It's I know you are, but what am I? So anything that he was doing, that he was accused of credibly, he'd turn around and accuse the other side of it. And that muddies the waters, because then people can both sides it, to your point, or rationalize it. And so when he would do that, it was laughable to those of us who knew that what he was actually doing was a threat to democracy. But the idea that J.D. Vance and all those folks were going out there and saying, like, oh, what about censorship? We're the ones that are being censored, and we're the ones that are champions for democracy, so you have freedom to say whatever you want. It was interesting, and obviously it worked, because it muddied the waters enough that it inoculated some of the pro-democracy arguments and the threats to democracy that our side was trying to put out there. I mean, when you have generals generals used to be respected, right? I mean, the generals and people like that were like, okay, these are military guys, they've earned it, we believe what they say. And when they're coming out who worked for him, warning, saying, listen, he said he wanted generals like Hitler's. The fact that that did not move people enough is very scary to me. And that, again, speaks to what Chris was talking about how the information, just the environment that we're in and how people get information is so complicated and different than before. That would have been many things would have been disqualifying. But that right there would have been something that, A, was unprecedented. We'd never seen anything like that before. The fact that so many Republicans and people who used to work for him closely came out and were like, listen to us, we were there. We saw what was happening. This guy does not care about you. He only cares about himself. He doesn't care about our democracy. But, we can't do this. We hear you. We don't agree with the other side, with Democrats on policy all the time, but none of that matters if we lose the whole thing. Didn't matter. People were set in their ways. They were like, whatever. And part of that is because of the way people digest information and where they get it from. And how we get out of that, how we dig out of that, I don't know. I mean, if we all had the answer to that, I think we'd be in a different place in this country. But that's what we need to work toward, because that's what we're up against. We've got to diagnose the problem first before we can come up with a solution.
But distrust of institutions wasn't born with Donald Trump's arrival on the presidential election stage. I mean, I covered Wall Street for a long time, certainly out of the financial crisis. There was a massive political movement that came out of that as well, saying, hey, the institutions failed to protect us, the consumers here, and a distrust of institutions and distrust of elites. I mean, this is a building thing. Chris, how do you solve it? How do you reverse it and rebuild institutions?
This is kind of the question of the moment. And you made the comment about how do we dig out of it?
Yeah.
There's no digging out of it. This is reality. So much has changed again in the information environment where there's so many more outlets. There's so many more sources. Are they all high quality? No. But that might not matter anymore. I think people are, in part, what we've seen is an exploitation of gatekeeping. We're like, look, I don't need to be told what's up and what's down. I can go figure that out myself. Now, I do think that over time, people will just become exhausted with doing their own research because they find that there are not high-quality sources of information. And so they just continually run into AI-generated crap. I mean, look, just go try to do a search for anything, right? Try to compare, for instance, just moved in, new house, want to get a new grill. I'm trying to compare two types of grills. Everything is AI generated and it gives no value. It's all dreck. And so I think people are going to start moving through that. Now, it could fork one of two ways. One is to actually people to know what the hell they're talking about, or others that simply kind of recognize what's happening and take advantage of it for their own purposes. So I think that's the kind of realization that we need to get through and power through and say, hey, look, we need to have a message that resonates with the broadest set of people and yet does not alienate within that large. So just like a business or any organization, you're trying to do a mission statement. If you do a mission statement that speaks to every single little detail, granular of the organization, it's going to be 50 words long and it's not going to resonate with anybody. So what's that broadest umbrella or net you can cast to get all the interests together that gives something a purpose and meaning and yet is inclusive enough, but not, edge case riddled? I think that's going to be the challenge.
I think this discussion does sort of get at another explanation for maybe why Trump won the election or why he was maybe a good fit for this and that. If you think about how the campaign unfolded, and of course, Trump is fundamentally an anti-institutional candidate. And so he rose throughout the Republican Party in large part because I think Republicans didn't like their own party leadership. They'd gone along with John McCain and Mitt Romney and they lost. And, we can get into the reasons for that. But, the Republican Party base was sort of ready to take a chance on this anti-institutional candidate. And actually, they had some, electoral success. I mean, the guy won twice. And then you think about also the sort of anti-institutional, anti-establishment sort of mood in the country. And I mean, we talk about where it comes from. I mean, it goes back half a century or more. Because you think about like Vietnam and Watergate as these sort of things that erode people's trust in the government. And if you look at like the long-term like Gallup or Pew surveys about what confidence level people have in governmental institutions and big institutions in general, it's generally very negative. Maybe military is accepted from it or police and fire, but small business is sometimes popular, but it's not really even an institution. And then you sort of think about not just Trump, but also the allies that he brought on during the campaign. So, Tulsi Gabbard and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. were doing events for him. They are both anti-institutional, anti-establishment candidates. Compare that to Biden as the ultimate establishment person, having been in elected politics for half a century. Harris, his heir is, his vice president. And so she's naturally connected to him. Some of the ways in which Harris was trying to reach across the aisle to Republicans. Liz Cheney was affiliated with the Center for Politics. She sort of represents the kind of foreign policy establishment of the other party. Whatever you think about Liz Cheney, she's not like an anti-institutional person the way that some of Trump's allies were. And so that really, to me, kind of heightened the contrast between the two two parties, and also the Republicans as the anti-institutional party, the Democrats as sort of the pro-institutional party. And ultimately, this was kind of an anti-institutional sort of election. And I think that's something Democrats probably need to think about in a time of low trust in institutions. If they're the institutional party, that's maybe an electoral challenge. Now, the good thing for them is that now Trump's in power, or is going to be in power, and he's going to do things that are unpopular. His popularity will probably erode. And the things that they can run against are the things that he's going to try to do and maybe fail to do. But that was just, as the election developed, that those differences between the two parties, I think, really kind of got heightened. And I think it probably helped the Republicans, or at least helped Trump.
I'll take on the information argument point of view, since I live in this world, maybe counterpoint, which is in some ways everything you're talking about, Chris, means that brands, curation, and actual verifiable sourced information has an increased value because it's more rare, but you need to find an audience for it that's willing to be receptive to it.
Who's watching it, right? Who's actually receiving it? A lot
That's the
have
question.
given up.
That's the problem.
They're going
right?
elsewhere.
That's it, is meeting people where they are. But if you believe that, then I think as a parent and not as a working journalist, I go, what are the next few generations going to think about being able to critically think and take those skills that you learn at GW or in the classroom at University of Virginia of, well, let me go back to primary source, or, well, that didn't quite sound right. Let me double check that against this. Like just basic establishment of fact is a skill that almost has to be re-taught to younger, or taught for the first time to younger people who are coming up to even be able to filter what is an overwhelming information environment with everyone who has a screen in their pocket right now and thinks that they, can do their own curation. We're putting a lot on consumers to be able to navigate a really crowded environment.
Yes and no. I think there's an angle because the students that are here right now from UVA, they're probably the tail end of that first generation that came up through kind of the sourcing education where Wikipedia is not a primary source, right? You can't go there, you have to go somewhere else. And the trick with
we still have to remind people that though.
Yeah, but remind us because we didn't grow up with that. It came on board later, and so we see it, we rely on it all the time. We're okay with the anonymity of it. I think what's happening now is instead of going to those anonymous sources, you end up on Reddit or you end up somewhere else. And you kind of get into it, you absorb it, and you identify the people that are most outspoken that seem to be credible, and you start associating, we talk about expertise with that person that you're then influenced. You can be, you can find those sorts of arguments compelling. And I think that's part of the difference right now. It's anonymity, it kind of works against you. Mm-hmm. But if you kind of marinate long enough in a community, you find those that are very outspoken, that want to put the effort into it for whatever reason, you don't know. But nonetheless, like their words tend to, hit home a little bit harder.
But then what do you do when you have leadership like the President of the United States and his cabinet that are full of degenerates that aren't experts on anything? To Alex's point, that people look to leaders as trusted sources, and now you have people who have been put into leadership positions, and now it's normalized not to be an expert in your relative place. I mean, let's be honest. Let's use NATO as an example, right? Donald Trump just nominated someone to be the ambassador to NATO who was involved in man toilet scams. You don't believe me? Google it, right? Matthew Whitaker was part of some kind of like scam where they were selling masculine toilets. I am not making that up. This is the guy who was acting attorney general and is now about to be the ambassador to NATO, the most important strategic alliance.
Pending Senate confirmation.
Yeah, pending Senate confirmation. And if you realize I'm already acting as if they're confirmed because I have no confidence in the Republican Senate to stand up to Trump more than once, if at all. We'll see. I hope I'm wrong there, but their history hasn't been great on that. I mean, if they didn't remove him for January 6th, I don't see them pushing back against much else, but we'll see. Maybe, I guess Matt Gaetz was a bridge too far so far, but I'm not holding my breath with them. But this kind of stuff, Tulsi Gabbard as DNI, a Fox News host guy as the defense secretary, these are not people who are the best. Donald Trump isn't bringing his best.
I think that.
So how do we, you know what I mean? Like if we're normalizing a lack of expertise, then how do people make that distinction, especially the younger generation?
I don't know.
Growing up in this
I think it's been a generation or more since political, even electeds, were really seen as the true leaders in the community. I mean, I think they've always been viewed skeptically, or at least for quite a long time.
Yeah.
Edelman studies for years now have shown that business leaders are the most trusted voices. And I think that's where we continue to look for that salvation of, is the business community going to step in? Are they going to they've been burned a couple times in the last couple of years. Iger and Disney with the Reedy Creek District for speaking up on some political issues in Florida. So there's definitely been some blowback, but I still think business leaders tend to be those that have the most influence broadly.
Well, a business leader has the most influence right now. He's the shadow president and Elon Musk, so I guess that's consistent.
So a lot of this falls on civil society and the implications of all this for civil society. And I think, if you look at the sort of the modern authoritarian playbook, in places like Hungary and Russia and other places, it's not always like you suspend elections. And I don't think this will be the last American Democracy Conference. I was here for the first, by the way. But
that was your optimistic point for the evening.
Yeah. So you don't get rid of elections, but what you do is you sort of undermine elements of civil society. So what remains to be seen is, like they're going to go after a Harvard or a place like that. They're going to go after the media. They're going to go after some business leaders, some billionaires potentially, who they view as opponents. And so the playbook is to sort of use government as a mechanism for going after opponents. And it's not because you're going to go after every opponent. It's because other people will then, has a chilling effect on other people. So how much will people like us or the next generation of people like us think, I'm not going to become a journalist who focuses on politics. That's, I don't need to deal with that. Or I don't need to be involved in government. Or I'm not going to speak out if I'm a CEO of a place and risk my profits and everybody who works in my company just because I've seen what happened to this billionaire or this journalist or
it's already started, Alex.
Yeah, so you're starting to see that, but that's the playbook. And the problem is that one of the problems convincing people that Donald Trump was an existential threat to American democracy was the fact that he had already been president and American democracy didn't end. That was not for his lack of trying. But it's hard to convince people of that.
Do you really believe that?
For what?
Existential threat to democracy.
100%.
Yeah, I mean, democracy is not a binary thing, right? Democracy is sort of a continuum. So I do think, yes, I think there's already been, I mean, look, 26% of Republicans in our pre-election poll told us, only 26% told us they were confident their ballots would be counted accurately. Right, that's absurd given how safe and secure our elections are. All of this,
and yet, very few objections to the outcome.
That's right. But it's still, this kind of stuff, the impact of this kind of stuff, I think it just permeates. We haven't even talked about political violence, right? Like people getting swatted, all of these things impact behavior in subtle ways sometimes and sometimes in less subtle ways. And so that's what you have to sort of watch out for. It's not that like the military is going to come in suddenly and take over or elections are going to be, called off. It's that, even in Hungary or in Turkey, and all these places, they have elections, but they are less democratic, small d democratic than we are, and that other countries are. And the reason for that is because of the self-censorship, but also the actual direct attacks from the government on all sorts of institutions of civil society.
It's interesting that you bring up, since you were talking about focusing on American politics purely, but you brought up the example of Hungary and Viktor Orban's government there. Because I've questioned now Vice President-elect, the Vice President-elect about that and praise that J.D. Vance, as senator, had for some of the things that Viktor Orban did in Hungary, particularly with universities and with
media,
with journalists as well. He said he doesn't like all of it, but he has some good ideas.
Yeah, that's the model.
You take that very literally, it sounds like.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think there's any question.
What do you think that means for universities? Because that it was interesting to me. He's not the first person to say that. There is a part of the conservative movement, the American conservative had a whole interview with him about it.
They had a whole conference. CPAC was in Hungary, and then they brought Orban here. That's been the model.
This is a small, not very economically successful country. It's a NATO member, a problematic one. What is it that is so attractive about that model exactly that should be, that should be striven for? You should strive for. Am I conjugating my words correctly? And why do you think that's taking off within the conservative movement?
I just think that because these are strong men and it's about political power.
Or is it specifically about education? Because you pointed to that also as a dividing
Well,
point in the
education
country.
is, I mean, the educated people and in particular universities. I mean, in this country, certainly it's been explicitly said, like the universities are part of the enemy, right? They're
The perception that they're overwhelmingly liberal.
yeah, they're doing this DEI stuff. They're teaching all of our kids to be liberals. So no, I mean it's part of the playbook. It's not only there. And by the way, most of this stuff is not going to be obvious to most voters, right? These are norms that will be violated gradually, and it's only like when it goes pretty far and you realize you can't really say exactly what you want to say, that without consequences or fear of consequences, that it becomes apparent to even the people, at play in these institutions, let alone, just average Americans.
In the book, How Democracies Die, they talk about that. It doesn't just happen like that. It happens slowly because the masses aren't paying attention, and it's slowly normalized as those rights and things are taken away. And that's what's that's what they did in Hungary. And why they went for education is because of what we just talked about. When you have the death of expertise, you don't have trusted voices anymore. You don't know what's actual fact versus garbage. And then, education is the key to freedom and critically thinking. So if you don't have that, and you don't have education anymore in the way that inspires free thinking, then that undermines liberal democracy. And so, of course, you're going to go there. Of course, you're going to go for the media. Again, it filters, controls information and how people digest that and how they make their decisions. It impacts behavior. Of course, you're going to go for those types of things because that's downward. It filters down into the populace of how people get their information and then how they make decisions and how they behave and what their tolerance level is, what their pain points are. I mean, this is the reason why Hungary is such a scary model, and the way that the conservatives, especially the Christian nationalists, because there's also a religious element to this too, they are looking at that because of the success that Orban has had. They said, oh, we can do that here, and they're already starting to do that. And so you look at Florida, look at what DeSantis is doing in schools in Florida. They're not just saying you can't say certain words, they're eliminating courses. They're eliminating sociology. They're eliminating, they're punishing people for what they call DEI and wokeness. Like that is a microcosm of what they want to scale up here. And guess where they got the model? Hungary, which also got that model from other places.
But Kyle, within the polling data that CBS had, there was the perception among conservatives that that moment was already here, of cancel culture, of being censored. And that was what, when we were asking about state of democracy and perception of it, conservatives were reacting to, saying they wanted to push back on that as a democratic norm. They wanted to reestablish the freedom, which was an interesting counterpoint to that perception.
I just want to say I'm the only person on the stage who has a Hungarian last name. So I'm an expert on Hungary. Just kidding, I'm not. I've been there once. To your point, look, I think there are some. I think that conservatives have some legitimate gripes with universities and being left-wing and this sort of thing. And this has been a complaint from conservatives for decades and decades. What I worry about, though, is that in the sort of stated desire to have balance or whatnot, that they end up sort of undermining some of these institutions, which are crown jewels of this country.
Yeah.
And frankly, one of the great things about the United States is that we still have all these great institutions, and institutions of higher learning are right at the top of the list. And again, that's not to say all the criticisms are illegitimate. I just worry that we, in ostensibly trying to quote unquote fix institutions, you end up destroying them or making them less attractive. I don't, despite having a Hungarian last name, I don't necessarily look at Hungary and say, oh, well, that's the model for the United States. I mean, that doesn't really seem to make a whole lot of sense to me.
Yeah. We're running out of time here, and Chris, I don't mean to bypass you, so if you have another thought, please jump in. But Tara, I want to ask you, because I've thought a fair amount about it coming out of this election. What do you think the message for the next generation of women in particular is? Not just from this election, but from what's happening with some of the appointees in particular and the questioning around conduct related to women?
I thought you would never ask. I think that this election sent a terrible message to women that we don't matter, that our rights being taken from us is secondary to the cost of eggs, and it shouldn't have to be one or the other. And the idea that this entire election was men versus women in some ways, that this whole bromance, brosphere, manosphere, toxic masculinity leaning into the Rogan, Hulk Hogan stuff, and it's a man's world being blared at the RNC. There was definitely, and then obviously the cheering on the alt-right about, it's, your body, my choice. Those kinds of messages are terrible. And I think that the majority of women who voted in this election that understood what was at stake for them are pissed off. And that women are not going to take this lying down, nor should we. I think that although it didn't work out in this election, there are still state and local elections, which are very important to our rights and to laws and things that are passed, that we need to continue to stand up and say, not no, but hell no, and channel that fear and that outrage into action. Because you cannot have a healthy democracy if women are treated as second-class citizens and that rights are continually taken away. And so the more that we impart that and we continue to speak out about that from a position of, as long as we still have a democracy and we can still use those avenues available to us to make a difference, we need to, because we cannot acquiesce and just roll over. One of the first rules of fighting back against tyranny, as Tim Snyder in his book says, is do not obey in advance. And I think women in this country will not do that, and we shouldn't. And if they're going to keep doing this to us and saying that we don't matter and that our lives don't matter and that you can put people into positions of power that have disrespected women, assaulted women, how they feel about women, that's not a consequence, well, we're going to make their lives very difficult and make sure they're held accountable for it. And they're going to have to go through us if they think that they're going to continue to do that. So I think for the younger generations and for the women who have lived through what it was like before, and when, pre-Roe and now, post-Dobbs, it's incumbent upon us to continue to channel that fear and outrage into action so that the generations after us don't have to ever go through what we're going through now again.
Chris, did you have a final thought?
I'm really focused right now on what the heck we're going to do about China.
Yeah.
I mean, so I'll just say that I was thankful that it was as quick and painless of an election as it was, at least post-election period, because we have real work ahead. Mm-hmm. China is a significant threat to the United States of America on many different fronts. And I said it on your show a couple times, I think. If not for that election, we would be talking about nothing but the risk that China poses to the global order, to the United States of America. And so that is what this team, this national security team, needs to be thinking about 24/7.
Mm-hmm. And Professor Sabato mentioned we cover foreign policy. I think it's just national security policy that we need to be talking about, period, within our politics because of the moment we are in. So you'll see it on Face the Nation, probably with Krebs himself. But thank you to all of the panelists here tonight. Thanks to all of you who are here in person and to those of you watching online. From George Washington University, this has been the 26th Annual UVA Center for Politics American Democracy Conference.
That was terrific. I learned a lot. I'm more afraid than I was when your panel started, and I was already scared to death. But in your 70s, what the heck? You got a couple of years left. What can happen? I guess gulags. I asked Liz Cheney, I said, Liz, can I be in your gulag? She said she'd do what she could. And so I feel good about it. As long as it has a pharmacy, I'll be fine. At my age, you just don't know. You're too young. You don't get it. Now, thank you all very, very much. It was great to have you. And now the reception. and you all deserve a drink. I think there's alcohol there, but none of the students will have any, none. I've already eliminated that possibility. We're at Duke's Grocery in Western Market, which is about 100 yards from here. I can even make it. I don't need my car. So I assume some of you know that, and just follow others who do know it. And let's go down and have a drink and something to eat together and talk about what we've learned. Thank you all for coming today.